Tonight's story doesn't begin with a king or a philosopher, but with something far more complicated and potentially much more dangerous: dating in the Middle Ages. With a touch of humor, we'll explore how finding love in a time of plagues, dowries, and ever-watchful chaperones could be even more awkward than texting someone, "What are you doing?" at 1 a.m. Because medieval romance wasn't about butterflies in your stomach, it was about land rights, livestock negotiations, and family alliances. Before we dive in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy this kind of sleepy storytelling. And in the comments, I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? It's always lovely to see this little community stretch across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for a soft hum in the background, and let your shoulders drop. Tonight's journey is about to begin. What even is dating in medieval terms? It wasn't called dating then, not the way we know it. There were no coffee shops, no late-night texts, no swipes left or right. But even in the quiet hush of stone villages and candlelit great halls, hearts still longed for connection. And love, fragile and tender, still dared to bloom between strangers. In a world without freedom to choose freely, affection had to be carefully hidden, like a rose beneath the snow. Glances were currency. A shared smile across the church pew was a bold declaration. Love was not loud. It whispered from shadowed alcoves and along moonlit corridors. For a young maiden, the flutter in her chest wasn't for a date at the tavern. It was for a moment stolen in the orchard, a word passed from a friend of a friend. And for the young knight, the thrill wasn't in the conquest, but in the tremble of his hand as he left a sprig of lavender at her window. That was medieval romance, slow, uncertain, and impossibly fragile. The term courtship was more fitting. It was a dance, deliberate and delicate. Not always fair and often decided by fathers, fortunes, and family names. But in the silent hours between chores or before the village bells rang for dusk, love found its chances. Maybe it wasn't always love. Maybe it was duty. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something sweeter, something real, something timeless. Because even in the cold stone corners of history, hearts beat the same rhythm, quietly, hopefully. And so, in that strange world of customs and corsets, something like dating existed. Not with swipes or dinners, but with longing looks. And dreams carried on parchment. The courtly love ideal. It was a love born not in bedrooms or ballrooms, but in the pages of poetry, wrapped in chivalry and dreams. Courtly love. The very words shimmer with longing. It wasn't about marriage. It wasn't even meant to last. It was about yearning. About worshiping someone from afar, as unreachable as a star and just as bright. The lady was always noble, always distant, her eyes like the sea before rain, her voice a melody carried on the wind. The knight? He was sworn to her, bound not just by duty, but by desire. He would fight for her, bleed for her, write verses in her honor. And she might never even glance his way. That was the beauty and the ache of it. This love was not meant to be practical. It was artful, stylized, restrained. A performance as much as a passion. Letters passed in secret, hands never touching, hearts aching in silence. It was a world where the promise of love was more powerful than its fulfillment.
And still, there was something tragically human in it.
The knight would ride off to war with her ribbon tied to his sword. She might sigh at her window, wondering if he thought of her beneath foreign stars. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But the dream lived on, untouched, eternal. In courtly love, devotion was everything. Not possession, not permanence, just the sacred beauty of wanting something you could never truly have. And so, behind the walls of grand castles and inside the faded pages of ancient poems, that kind of love endured. Beautiful, impossible, heartbreaking, and somehow, enough. How nobles flirted with poetry. They didn't swipe or scroll or send emojis. They picked up quills, elegant, trembling things, and wrote poems. Love, for the nobles of the medieval world, wasn't spoken plainly. It was veiled, dressed in metaphor, tucked between lines of rhymed longing. To flirt was to write. To seduce was to write well. In the candlelight of stone chambers, where shadows flickered against ancient tapestries, young men penned verses with trembling hands. They wrote of eyes like stormy skies, of lips that bloomed like roses in frost. They praised a lady's grace, her silence, her smile, always from afar, always with reverence. The poems weren't always original. Some borrowed from troubadours who wandered from court to court, singing of impossible love and eternal yearning. These traveling poets were stars in their time, romantic messengers for those too timid or too careful to speak plainly. A well-placed verse could melt a noblewoman's heart or cause a scandal. Ladies, too, learned to write, discreetly, delicately. A hidden reply in delicate script could be the beginning of something more. It might be folded into a locket or stitched into the lining of a sleeve, safe from curious eyes. Each word was precious, heavy with meaning, and sometimes it was enough to write just one line, a single sentence that said, "I see you," even if they could never meet alone. Flirting with poetry was more than art. It was survival. Because noble marriages were contracts, deals struck between families, fortunes, and future titles. Love wasn't expected, and sometimes it wasn't even welcome. But poetry? Poetry was a secret rebellion, a quiet chance to feel, to hope, to imagine something tender in a world ruled by duty. And still, hearts broke. Letters went unanswered. A verse might be burned unread, a ribbon returned without a word. That was the risk. But it was also the thrill. Sometimes, poetry led to nothing but dreams. Other times, it led to quiet affairs, glances across a crowded hall, a shared smile at a feast. And in rare whispered stories, tales too fragile for history books, it led to love. In those fleeting lines of ink, nobles lived out what they could not say aloud. They became braver on parchment. They confessed more in rhyme than they ever could face to face. And though time has taken their names, many of their verses remain, tucked in dusty manuscripts, still echoing with the heartbeat of a distant, yearning past. A past where love was written, not spoken. Village love and shy glances. Love in the village didn't come with poetry. Not usually. There were no velvet gloves or golden rings, no troubadours strumming beneath balconies. It was simpler, quieter, but no less real. It began in moments so small most wouldn't notice. A boy helping lift a basket too heavy for her arms. A girl brushing flour from her apron and meeting his eyes for just a second too long. No words were needed. Sometimes there were none. But there were glances. Shy ones. Stolen ones. The kind that filled the silence with possibility. The village was a small world. Everyone knew everyone. That made love hard and thrilling. A blush at the well could be the talk of the whole square by dusk. Gossip was a part of the air, floating like smoke from the hearth. Still, hearts didn't stop because people watched. If anything, they beat faster. They saw each other at the bread ovens, in the fields, at church on Sundays. And always, they watched. He noticed the way her braid fell against her shoulder. She noticed how his hands moved when he carved wood or tended to the sheep. Each chore became a kind of dance, a wordless courtship woven into the rhythm of life. There were no private moments, but there were corners behind cottages, lanes shaded by trees, the rare joy of being paired together for a harvest or festival. Then, maybe, a laugh was shared, or a hand brushed too close. Parents often had plans, promises made, dowries discussed. But village love didn't always follow those paths. Young hearts wandered, even when they weren't supposed to. And when feelings grew too strong to hide, they might leave tokens. A flower left on a doorstep, a ribbon dropped where she would find it. Nothing was said. Everything was felt. Sometimes it was enough. Sometimes it wasn't. There were tears cried behind barns, and boys who married others. There were girls sent away to distant farms, where glances didn't mean anything anymore. But in those soft, uncertain beginnings, love was alive. Fragile, yes, but present. Theirs wasn't the love of legends. It was the kind that grew like ivy on stone, slowly, stubbornly, beautifully. It didn't need a stage. It only needed a moment, a shared glance, a held breath. And long after those young lovers had grown old and gray, the village remembered. The way he waited for her outside the chapel, the way she smiled at him, even when she wasn't supposed to. Those shy glances became part of the story, not just theirs, but the village's. Because even in the most ordinary places, love leaves something behind: arranged marriages and parental power. Love didn't always have a say, not when it came to marriage. In the medieval world, the heart was a quiet thing, soft, delicate, and easily silenced by the clang of gold and the weight of family names. It wasn't cruelty, not always. It was survival. For noble families, marriage was strategy, a land deal wrapped in lace, a peace treaty sealed with a kiss that neither bride nor groom had asked for. Parents chose. Lords and ladies nodded in agreement. And somewhere, across the room, a young girl lowered her eyes and accepted her future. She might be 14. He might be 30. Or older. It didn't matter. What mattered was the land he owned, the alliances he brought, the wealth that would be secured. The girl's dowry, cows, coin, linens, or land, would pass hands. And she would too. Sometimes, there was kindness in it, a husband who was gentle, a match that surprised everyone. But just as often, there was coldness. Marriages between strangers, between men and girls, between silence and obligation. In the villages, it wasn't so different. Parents still chose, only with smaller fortunes at stake. A strong pair of arms, a fertile patch of land, a family with enough bread to feed another mouth. These were the currencies of love, not passion, but practicality. And yet, hearts still beat. Quietly, stubbornly. Behind every arranged match, there was a young woman who had once dreamed of someone else. A young man who had hoped for laughter, not expectation. They rarely got to choose, but they did learn to live, to adapt, and sometimes, over time, to love the one they were given. Other times, they didn't. Some women wept on wedding nights they never wanted. Some men drank too much to quiet the ache of something lost. And behind the smiles at feasts and festivals, entire lifetimes unfolded, built not on love, but on obedience. Still, there were small rebellions. A secret letter kept hidden in a bodice. A locket with a different man's name etched inside. A pause before saying, yes, even when the answer didn't matter. Arranged marriages weren't always cruel, but they were rarely tender. They taught people to survive, to perform, to endure. And in doing so, they shaped a world where love, true love, became a kind of miracle. Rare, unlikely, all the more precious for its fragility. Even then, even in duty, hearts hoped. Because somewhere, in the cold comfort of arranged vows, people still longed for more. A touch that was wanted, a voice that made them smile, a glance that wasn't assigned, but chosen. And sometimes, if the stars were kind, they got it. Dowries and negotiations. Before the vows, before the lace, before the first shy glance at the altar, there were the negotiations. Quiet, deliberate, always serious. Love was a distant whisper in these conversations, faint, almost irrelevant. What mattered was the dowry. A daughter was never just a daughter. She was a promise, a gift, a weight. And when the time came, she became a ledger line. Her worth was measured in acres, cattle, bolts of silk, or sometimes just coin in a chest. Not because her parents didn't love her, but because that was the way of the world. Fathers bartered gently but firmly. Mothers waited in silence, eyes cast downward, hands folded over anxious hearts. The girl, young, often frightened, said nothing. Her future was being traded in a quiet room lit by firelight, while she embroidered by the window and pretended not to listen. Some dowries were generous. They opened doors to fine houses, noble families, a future of soft fabrics and silver goblets. Others were modest. They secured no more than a roof and a man with work-worn hands. But always the price was paid, because a woman without a dowry was rarely chosen. And if she wasn't chosen, her path narrowed, slowly, cruelly. In noble halls, dowries shaped alliances. A duchess might be wed for a vineyard. A baron's son promised to a girl whose lands touched the sea. It wasn't cold-hearted. It was business. Marriage was a transaction. The ceremony? just the signature at the bottom of the deal. But even in these barters of futures, emotion found cracks to bloom through. There were fathers who gave more than they could afford just to see their daughter cared for. Mothers who slipped a final embroidered handkerchief into the chest, the stitches spelling out a secret prayer. And girls who clung to hope, even as the negotiations sealed shut the life they once dreamed of. Not every bride wept. Some understood the game. Some even played it. A clever girl with a clever dowry could change her fate, could marry well, could climb. And once the match was made, the dowry passed hands like a promise. The daughter followed. She would arrive at her new home with linens and china, a cradle perhaps, and all the fears she dared not speak. The marriage would begin. And whatever followed, kindness or cruelty, comfort or loneliness, was hers to endure.
Yet still, the dowry was not everything.
Because no matter how carefully they measured her worth in silver and goats and blankets, she remained something more. A person with a heart. A heart that might one day learn to love, even if no one negotiated for that. When love met property deals. In a world built on land and lineage, love came second, if it came at all. The truth was simple and unspoken. Marriage was business. Fields, forests, vineyards, they were the real dowry. And love? Love was the delicate thread woven in last, if there was room. The property came first. A girl's name on a deed meant power. If she brought with her fertile land, grazing pastures, or a mill by the river, she was valuable. Not because of her laugh or her eyes, but because of the barley her fields could yield. And so, love walked in late, unsure, unwelcome. A young man might meet a girl at a summer fair, her braid catching sunlight, her voice as warm as fresh bread. But if her family held no land, the romance ended before it began. Because hearts didn't stand a chance against stone walls and boundary lines. Families didn't gamble on affection, they invested in futures. So many couples stood side by side at altars, strangers bound not by desire, but by signature. She brought him orchards. He brought her a title. And both of them brought silence. Quiet, careful hope that maybe, just maybe, something more might come after.
And sometimes it did.
In the stillness of early mornings, they learned each other. How she liked her tea, how he watched the sky before rain. And love, slow and surprising, began to take root not in the moment they said, "I do," but in the days that followed, in small mercies, in kindnesses exchanged when no one was watching. But other times, there was only distance. He cared for his land, not his wife. She tended his home, but never his heart. They lived beside one another, like two castles across a river, together, but unreachable. And the land? It thrived. The barns filled. The crops grew. But something softer wilted. Something that no parchment or property line could fix. Still, hope lingered. It always did. Because even within the coldest negotiations, there was a whisper of something warmer. A glance across a long table. A gift left quietly on a pillow. A walk shared in silence that said, "I am trying." And in those rare moments, property became secondary. And love, unexpected, uninvited, stepped in. Maybe that's what made it so precious. Because when love bloomed inside a contract, when affection grew despite the paperwork, it was a miracle. Fragile, hard-won, and infinitely beautiful. Even in a world ruled by land and legacy, hearts still found a way. Secret courtships. Not every love story began with permission. Some began in the shadows. Behind stone walls and heavy curtains, feelings bloomed in silence. A glance held too long. A touch that lingered just a moment more than it should. In a world where marriage was chosen by families, not hearts, love had to learn how to hide. And so it did. It hid behind garden hedges and chapel doors. It whispered in the corners of kitchens, in the stables, in the flickering candlelight when no one else was watching. Letters were tucked into sleeves. Ribbons were tied in a certain way. Everything was code, and everything was risk. They loved with their eyes first, then with their hearts, and only later, if they dared, with their words. For a noble daughter promised to a man she didn't know, the stable boy's hands looked safer than gold. For a second son with no inheritance, the baker's daughter's laugh was wealth enough. But these courtships were dangerous. Discovery meant disgrace, ruin, or worse. So they met in secret. They arranged their moments like stolen jewels. 5 minutes after vespers, a glance across the marketplace, a walk by the river if the moon was low and the village asleep. And in those small, hidden hours, they were simply themselves. Not heirs, not daughters, not pawns. Just two people trying to love in a world that didn't always allow it. They promised what they could. A flower pressed between pages. A lock of hair. A whispered vow. Sometimes it ended in heartbreak. A father found a note. A brother noticed a change. The girl was sent away. The boy vanished. And the courtship, once so alive, faded like breath on a window pane. But sometimes, just sometimes, it became something more. They ran, or they waited, or they endured. And years later, with hands a little more weathered, they stood beside each other, not in secret, but in sunlight. That was the magic of secret courtships. They weren't meant to survive, but when they did, they became legend. Because the kind of love that dares to hide is often the kind that never dies. Monasteries, where romance was forbidden. There were places where love was not only unlikely, but forbidden, where hearts were expected to be quiet, still, and entirely given to God. These were the monasteries and convents, walled-off worlds of silence and scripture, prayer and purpose. To enter was to leave the world behind. No marriage, no touch, no laughter that echoed too brightly in the halls. Just duty, just devotion, just the slow, careful rhythm of a life lived without earthly distractions. And yet, the human heart is stubborn. Even behind high stone walls and beneath stiff woolen robes, something soft could stir. A glance exchanged between two novices during morning chores. A kindness extended during illness. A conversation that lingered a little too long after evening prayers. They weren't supposed to feel it. They weren't supposed to want. But feelings aren't undone by vows. They slip in through cracks, quiet, uninvited, impossible to ignore. A young monk might kneel for prayer and find his mind wandering, not to heaven, but to the memory of a girl from the village. A novice nun might write her daily scripture and wonder what it would feel like to hold someone's hand. Some of them had never known love before they entered. Some had known it too well, and come here to forget. Others came unwillingly, promised to the church by families who could not afford dowries or feared the shame of an unwed daughter. And in those cases, the silence wasn't peace. It was loneliness. The rules were clear. No touching, no longing, no looking. But even the firmest vows couldn't always tame the human soul. Secret letters were sometimes passed, hidden in the bindings of books or beneath a dish of bread. A meeting might take place in the gardens, beneath a winter sky, hands brushing briefly before parting forever. And when the feelings became too strong, when the quiet ache turned into something unbearable, they confessed. Not to each other, to God, to the abbess, to the prior. And the punishment was often gentle, but cold. Isolation. Shame. A new assignment far away. Some never fell in love. Some didn't want to. They found comfort in the order, in the rituals, in the clarity of a life without complications. For them, the monastery was a sanctuary in the truest sense. But others dreamed. They dreamed of letters they'd never write, of arms they'd never hold, of a life that could have been. And so, even in the quietest corners of the medieval world, even in the very places where love was outlawed, it still found a way to exist. Quietly, desperately, invisibly. Because love, like water, always finds the smallest crack and seeps through, even when all the doors have been shut. Love tokens and lace hankies. Love didn't always need grand gestures. Sometimes it lived in the smallest things, thread and ribbon, buttons and beads, pressed flowers wrapped in twine. These were the tokens lovers gave when words were too dangerous, when time was too short, or when all they had was the wish to be remembered. A lace hanky, soft and handmade, might carry more weight than 1,000 promises. It was stitched slowly, carefully, often in secret. Every knot tied with hope, every edge hemmed with the silence of unsaid things. She would pass it to him quickly, beneath a cloak, into his saddlebag, or dropped by accident in a place only he would find. To anyone else, it was just cloth. But to him, it was everything. He might carry it with him into battle, tucked against his chest, or sleep beside it on cold nights, letting its scent remind him of home, of her. Some tied them around their swords or their wrists, a private vow no one else could see. Men gave tokens too. A carved trinket, a ribbon from a festival, a coin worn from years of use, now blessed with meaning because it had been his. He would leave it in her basket, press it into her palm with a glance that said, "Remember me." They couldn't say much in public. Courting was formal, observed, filled with rules. But these tokens, simple, quiet, deeply personal, broke all the rules gently. Each object held a piece of someone's heart, and sometimes they lasted longer than the love itself. A woman might grow old and still keep the carved bird her first love made, long after she had married another. A man might carry a dried bloom pressed into his book, the edges browned, the memory untouched. Because those moments were real, even if they passed. And the tokens? They didn't forget. Not every token led to a happy ending. Not every hanky was returned. Some were thrown into fires after heartbreak. Others buried beneath trees as silent goodbyes. But they mattered all the same. Because when someone couldn't say, "I love you," they could give something that whispered it instead. Love was not always safe in the medieval world. It wasn't always allowed. But even when it had to stay quiet, it still reached out, through thread, through wood, through anything the hands could offer when the lips had to stay still. These tokens were their language. And long after the voices fell silent, the objects remained, tucked into drawers, sewn into gowns, hidden behind bricks, waiting, remembering. Proof that love was there, that it had lived, even if only for a moment. Letter writing with wax seals. Before voices could carry across distances by wire or screen, they traveled by ink. Slow, deliberate, and intimate. Letters were the language of love, especially for those who could not be near. And in the medieval world, a letter was more than paper. It was a lifeline, a confession, a risk. Writing was a skill not all possessed, but among the nobility, among the educated, it was cherished. And lovers, separated by war or duty, wrote not to pass time, but to hold each other close, across the days and miles. The words came carefully, each sentence crafted like lace, not too bold, not too plain, full of metaphors and polite longing, layered with the subtle grace of someone who knew how easily the wrong phrase could be misread or discovered. And then came the seal. Wax, melted and soft, was dripped carefully onto the folded parchment. A ring pressed into it left a symbol, an emblem, a crest, or a simple heart. It was more than decoration. It was protection, proof, identity. Without that seal, the letter could be read by anyone. With it, it became sacred. Sometimes, those letters were never sent, kept hidden in boxes, written just to release the ache. Other times, they were smuggled out by a trusted servant or slipped between the pages of a prayer book. Some traveled hundreds of miles on horseback, enduring rain, snow, danger, all for a few words. They were read slowly, held close, reread by candlelight, memorized, kissed. Not all were answered, and some were intercepted, burned before ever reaching the one who waited. But those that survived, they were treasure. Love lived in those letters. Love that couldn't be spoken aloud. Love that had to cross fields, borders, oceans. Love that defied silence. And each wax seal, once cracked open, felt like unlocking a door to someone's heart. Some wrote of longing, others of dreams. Some offered poems, promises, plans. Many just offered presence. I am here. I am thinking of you. You are not alone. Even now, centuries later, a few of these letters still survive, fragile as dried petals, ink faded to brown, wax seals broken, but the intention intact. They remind us that love doesn't need voices, that even when distance stretches long and uncertain, two hearts can still speak, still reach, still hold one another in words. And in every fold of parchment, in every curl of ink, there is a kind of closeness that time cannot erase. Love, sealed with wax, carried across the world, waiting to be opened. Love in castles versus cottages. Love was not the same everywhere. It wore different clothes depending on where it lived. In castles, love came dressed in velvet and gold. It stepped carefully across polished stone, spoke in hushed tones, and always glanced over its shoulder. Everything was formal, watched, bound by rules. A noblewoman didn't fall in love openly. She entertained suitors. She curtsied and smiled, played the lute, poured wine, and waited for permission to feel something. Her heart was never fully hers. Love in castles was complicated. It came with expectations. A nobleman might admire her, write her verses, even send gifts. But marriage required strategy. Land, titles, legacy. Passion was a luxury one few could afford. But even behind those high walls, even in the echo of grand halls and icy chambers, love still found a way to slip through. In a hidden smile, a quiet stroll through the gardens, a letter left on a windowsill. And if it was real, if it was mutual, it was as precious as gold. Because love that survived a castle's cold rules was a miracle. In cottages, it was different. There was no velvet, no lace, just worn linen and hands rough from work. But there was freedom, and with it, honesty. Love in a cottage didn't need permission. It was often hurried, messy, and tangled with real life. A shepherd and a weaver's daughter might meet at the well, laugh over spilled milk, and know they would marry without ever needing a proposal. Their love was built in shared chores, in caring for the same goat, in watching the seasons change together. It didn't come with poems, but it came with warmth. The cottage didn't offer wealth or security, but it offered truth. And in the flickering firelight of a one-room home, two people could fall asleep listening to the same storm, their hands touching beneath a woolen blanket. No witnesses, no ceremony, just belonging. Of course, it wasn't always easy. Hard winters, hungry years, illness, loss. Love in a cottage had to be strong. It had to bend, stretch, forgive. It wasn't love built on ceremony. It was love built on survival. In the end, one wasn't better than the other. They were just different stories, told in different languages. Castles and cottages both held hearts that beat. They both housed secrets, longings, goodbyes. And sometimes the two worlds touched, briefly, impossibly. A lord who fell for a servant, a lady who loved a poet. Love that crossed the distance between velvet and hay. Not all those stories ended well, but the ones that did, they were remembered. Because they proved that love doesn't care where it lives. Whether behind stone towers or beneath a thatched roof, it still wants the same thing: to be seen, to be chosen, and to stay. Chaperones and watchful eyes. In the medieval world, love was never truly alone. It was followed, observed, and carefully managed. Eyes were always watching. Mothers, nurses, aunts, guardians, and sometimes even servants who spoke more with their silence than with words. A young woman of good family was never left unattended. Not because she was fragile, but because her reputation was. One rumor could undo everything. A glance held too long. A laugh that sounded too easy. A walk taken without permission. These could become scandal, ruin, shame. And so, chaperones were appointed, and their job was not to protect the girl's heart, but her future. They sat close at feasts. They rode a step behind on the road. They stood near while young men visited, their presence like a quiet reminder. Not too close, not too soon. But the heart, when watched too closely, often beats louder. Lovers learn to speak without words. A dropped glove, a flicker of the eyes, a carefully timed exit. Some chaperones turned blind eyes. Some even remembered being young once and allowed a little space, just enough for a soft word exchanged in passing. But others were strict. They believed in honor, in rules, in never allowing a moment unsupervised. For noble families, marriage was a matter of legacy, not affection. A daughter's virtue was not hers, it was the family's. And if she gave it away too soon, it wasn't just her heart that would break. It was their status, their future, their pride. So even innocent love had to be careful. Village girls knew the feeling too. Though their worlds were smaller, the stakes still felt enormous. A curious neighbor, a protective brother, gossip moving faster than the wind. A moment behind a barn could follow a girl for the rest of her life. And yet, love still tried. They learned patience. They carved out minutes from hours. They found ways to be close even with space between them. A shared walk to church. A group ride to market where knees brushed and no one said a thing. Small rebellions, sweet victories. Sometimes the chaperone was kind. Sometimes she looked away on purpose. Sometimes she smiled at a secret only lovers thought they had hidden. But even then, her presence was always there, a gentle pressure, like lace wound a little too tight. For some, it became part of the romance. The thrill of secrecy, the tension of being near, but not allowed to touch. And when, at last, the day came where they could speak freely, sit side by side, hold hands without fear, it meant more, because they had waited, endured, loved through silence. Even under the watchful eyes, love grew, quietly, bravely, like wildflowers blooming between stones. The role of matchmakers. Not every love began with a glance. Some began with an introduction. Before hearts could meet, families met first. And often, in the space between two names and the weight of two fortunes, stood the matchmaker. They were women, most often, experienced, observant, trusted. Their job was not just to arrange marriages. It was to calculate possibility. She knew which families had fallen on hard times, which daughters were still unmarried, which sons had grown restless and ambitious. She knew who was kind, who was cruel, and most importantly, who was available. But she also knew the hearts behind the names. The matchmaker walked the line between logic and longing. She listened to mothers who wanted good husbands for their daughters, and to fathers who wanted strong alliances. But she also watched the way a girl's voice shifted when a name was mentioned, the way a boy glanced toward the door at the sound of soft footsteps. She noticed what others missed. Sometimes the matchmaker was a family friend, sometimes a traveling stranger with a reputation. But when she spoke, people listened, because her word was opportunity. Her introductions could shape futures, and her failures, rare as they were, became whispers behind hands in the marketplace. She carried names like cards in a deck, waiting for the right moment to pair them. She spoke softly. She chose her words carefully. She knew how to make a future sound like fate. But love, of course, doesn't always obey. There were matches that looked perfect on paper and yet felt cold once the vows were spoken. There were couples that should have worked, similar, sensible, strong, but who sat across from one another in silence, never quite meeting in the middle. And then there were the surprises. A timid girl and a serious boy, brought together for convenience, who fell deeply, unexpectedly, and completely in love. Or a second son, considered too poor for a proper bride, who captured the heart of a clever merchant's daughter the moment they met. Those were the stories matchmakers lived for, when the logic lined up and the spark appeared anyway. Sometimes she even bent the rules, suggested a match that didn't quite meet the family's expectations, risked her own reputation for something she felt. And sometimes, she was right. When a match worked, it was a kind of quiet magic, a life set in motion by a single introduction, a household formed, children born, generations that owed their beginning to a woman with a list of names and a well-worn smile. The matchmaker never stayed. She moved on to the next village, the next request, the next pair of hopeful hearts. But behind her, she left something lasting, a story that began with a name whispered across a table and turned, slowly, beautifully into a life shared, public declarations and bans. Before a wedding could happen, the world had to be told, not with glittering invitations or elegant parchment, but with words spoken aloud 3 times for all to hear. In the heart of the church, before God and neighbor, a name was spoken, then another. And just like that, the banns were read. It was tradition, it was law, and it was the medieval way of saying, "This union is coming. Does anyone object?" The priest stood tall at the front of the congregation. Sunlight spilled through stained glass, candles flickered, and he read the names slowly, clearly. The first time, heads turned. By the second, whispers had begun. By the third, there were eyes watching every move the couple made. These declarations weren't romantic. They were practical. They gave the village a chance to speak. If a groom had made promises elsewhere, if a bride was not free to marry. Secrets had little room to hide when the bans were spoken in public, and yet there was something sacred in the act. For couples who had loved in secret, who had passed notes and shared glances and walked the long road of waiting, this moment was everything. This was the moment love stepped into the light. Now, everyone knew. In the pews, neighbors sat with folded hands. Some smiled, some frowned, but all of them listened. And for the bride, it might feel like standing in the middle of a dream, her name on the priest's lips, his name beside hers, the future just a few Sundays away. Not everyone celebrated. Some mourned a match they had hoped for. Others judged from afar. But once the bans had been read 3 times without protest, there was no going back. The church became a witness, the village a chorus. Sometimes there were objections, a secret lover stepping forward, a rival family making claims. Hearts broke in those moments, plans unraveled. But more often, there was silence. And in that silence, something peaceful bloomed. Acceptance, blessing, readiness. And when the bans had passed, when the final name was spoken and no one rose to stop it, the couple walked home a little differently. Hand in hand, watched, whispered about, but together. Because now the world knew. There would be a wedding. There would be vows. And whether it began in strategy or love, in poetry or quiet affection, this union had survived the scrutiny of the public. It had stood tall in the face of tradition and rules and waiting. And now it would begin. Weddings were business deals? For all the lace and flowers, for all the songs sung and hands held, most weddings in the medieval world were not about love. They were about land, about legacy, about 2 families looking at a union not as a story, but as a transaction. It sounds harsh now, but back then, it was simply the way of things. A marriage was a contract, no different from a trade agreement or a land grant. 2 names joined on paper. Property shifted. Alliances were sealed. And somewhere in the middle stood a bride. She might be 15, dressed in her finest, her hair brushed until it shone, her heart quiet, beating but uncertain. Not because she didn't believe in love, she did, but because no one had asked her if this was it. Across from her stood the groom, sometimes young, sometimes much older, dressed in velvet, holding himself like a man who understood duty. Because that's what this day was about, duty. And in the eyes of their parents, this was a success, a match made well, a negotiation that had ended with satisfaction on both sides. Livestock had been counted, coins exchanged, a dowry agreed upon, witnesses gathered, everything in order. The ceremony might have music, a priest with kind eyes, a feast to follow. But beneath the celebration, a truth remained. This union had less to do with hearts and more to do with borders, titles, wealth. Even the church approved. Marriage stabilized kingdoms. It ended wars. It kept the bloodlines clean. But still, not everything could be arranged. In the quiet of the wedding night, with candles burning low, they were no longer contracts. Just 2 people, often strangers, nervous, tender, uncertain. And in that space, something new could begin. Maybe it would become love. Maybe it wouldn't. But the wedding had done its job. The deal was sealed, the families united. The paperwork, if there was any, was signed. For the noble, the powerful, the well-born, this was the way things were done. Weddings as signatures, brides as bargaining chips, grooms as inheritors of a plan. And yet, even in those marriages that began as transactions, stories unfolded. Some couples surprised everyone. They laughed. They built quiet joy. They learned to love each other not with fireworks, but with small, daily grace. And some never warmed. They lived beside each other, like bookends on a shelf, present, silent, unmoving. The wedding was the beginning of something, but no one could say for certain what that something would be. It was a business, yes, but sometimes, in the cracks of that deal, love still managed to bloom, unexpected, soft, real. Because even when hearts were not consulted, they still had their own say, consent, or the lack thereof. There are parts of history that don't soften with time. This is one of them. In the medieval world, marriage was often decided for people, not with them. Love might be hoped for, happiness might follow. But choice? That was rare, especially for women. Consent, as we understand it now, the freedom to say yes or no without fear, was not the standard. It was a privilege, a luxury, and for many, it was simply never offered. A girl could be promised before she even reached womanhood, a deal made when she was still learning how to braid her own hair. Fathers arranged matches, mothers nodded silently, and daughters obeyed. Sometimes there was kindness, a suitor who asked gently, a family who listened. But far more often, there was assumption. A nod from the father meant agreement. A silence from the bride meant acceptance. And so, she stood at the altar, not because her heart leapt, but because she was told to. For noble women, it was about bloodlines and alliances. For village girls, it was about survival. A husband meant protection, a home, a future. To refuse was to risk shame, gossip, even exile. And what of the wedding night? There, too, choice was complicated. A wife was expected to give herself to her husband, expected to submit, to bear children, to serve. There was no space to say no, not safely. Not all men were cruel. Some were patient, gentle, willing to wait. But the truth remains, the power was not equal. And where power is uneven, so is freedom. Still, in small ways, some claimed what little choice they could. A delayed answer, a fainting fit, a quiet plea to a kind priest. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. And for the men, some were forced too. Pressured by fathers, by duty, by names that carried too much weight. There were grooms who married with tired eyes, dreaming of someone else. Men who loved differently, quietly, secretly, never allowed to speak it. Not all stories from this time are fair. Not all are romantic, and some are painful to look at. But they are real. And in telling them gently, we remember that history is not just pageantry and poetry. It's people, often young, often voiceless, doing what they were told, hoping sometimes that love would follow the vow. Sometimes it did. Other times, they endured. They raised families, shared tables, grew old beside someone they never chose. And even then, the heart still whispered, still dreamed, still waited. Because deep inside us all, through every century, there is a voice that longs not just to be heard, but to be asked. Jealousy, gossip, and small-town drama. In the quiet villages of the medieval world, love didn't bloom unnoticed. It grew under watchful eyes. There were no secrets for long in towns with one inn, one chapel, one crooked little street where chickens wandered freely and laundry flapped on every line. Doors were rarely locked, windows were rarely closed, and hearts tried to keep their secrets, but gossip was faster than love ever could be. It didn't take much to set it off. A glance held too long between a baker's daughter and a tanner's son. A shared walk after vespers. A scarf borrowed. A smile exchanged while drawing water at the well. Soon someone would see, someone would whisper, She's been walking with him again. He gave her a ribbon, blue this time. Her cheeks were red when he passed. And just like that, a story began. In small towns, gossip was currency, a pastime, a way to pass the slow hours between chores. It moved between baskets of grain and loaves of bread, passed from lips to ears like wildfire through dry grass. The blacksmith's wife told the cooper's sister. The cooper's sister told the midwife. And by sundown, what had been a moment became a scandal. Some didn't mind. Young lovers who laughed in the face of it, who enjoyed the attention, who wore their budding romance like armor. But others, more cautious, more vulnerable, learned to hide, to love behind closed doors, in shadows, with hearts thudding like thunder against their ribs. And where there was gossip, there was jealousy. Not all hearts found who they wanted. Not all boys chased the girls who chased them back. And that left wounds, quiet ones, bitter ones. The shepherd's daughter who had dreamed of the miller's son all her life, only to watch him fall for the girl with curls and new shoes. The widow who had begun to hope again until the handsome traveler turned his gaze toward someone younger. The boy who carved her name into bark one summer only to see her marry another by winter. And from those wounds, jealousy bloomed. Green and sharp and hard to confess, it dressed itself as disapproval, as concern, as casual remark. He could do better. She's not as innocent as she seems. I heard she's been meeting him late at night. Sometimes it was true, sometimes it wasn't. But the power of the story was rarely in the truth. It was in the telling. And yet, even in the sharpness of gossip, there was something strangely tender. Because people gossiped not just to wound, but to understand, to connect, to feel a part of something bigger than their own four walls. They talked about love because love mattered, because it made the village feel alive, because behind every rumor was a wish for a story worth repeating, for a love worth watching. The drama wasn't always cruel. Sometimes it brought people together. A broken-hearted girl found comfort in the baker's wife, who remembered a similar heartbreak 50 years earlier. A boy, stung by rumors, was defended by a friend who stood taller than expected. Sometimes the whole village rallied around a couple. Raised eyebrows softened into warm bread left on doorsteps, into invitations to sit beside the hearth, into blessings whispered during storms. But not always. Some couples didn't survive the noise, the pressure, the weight of a love watched too closely. Misunderstandings turned into distance, distance into silence, and then nothing. All that was left was the echo of what might have been, carried in the voices of those who once talked about them every day, and now mentioned them with a quiet, wistful shrug. Do you remember? I wonder what would have happened if... Still, the drama didn't stop love. It couldn't. If anything, it sharpened it, gave it urgency, made every touch more daring, every glance more precious, because they knew someone was always watching. And in that tension, something beautiful formed. Love that withstood gossip became stronger. Love that faced jealousy became braver. And love that endured small-town scrutiny, that outlasted rumors and sideways glances, often became something truly rare. Because love that grows in the open wind learns how to bend, how to root deeply, how to hold on. Of course, the drama didn't stop at courtships. Weddings were just the beginning. Whispers followed couples for years about how quickly the baby came, how often he was away, how she looked too fondly at the night visiting from the next village. A lifetime of glances, of quiet exchanges, of scenes played out in corners. It never really stopped. But somewhere in all of that talking, people grew. They forgave. They forgot. They fell in love again, sometimes with the same person they had once doubted. And the gossip? Eventually, it moved on. It always did. From one love story to the next. Because in the end, small-town drama was just the background noise to the beating heart of every village. A soft, flawed human chorus reminding everyone that love, real love, always leaves a ripple behind. Even when it starts with a look at the well, even when it ends with a quiet sigh. Widow remarriage and second chances. Not all love stories began with first glances. Some began later, after sorrow, after silence, after the mourning veil had been lifted, and the world asked softly, "What now?" In the medieval world, death came often. It came early. And with it came widows and widowers, left behind to carry on with work to do, mouths to feed, and hearts heavy with absence. For some, that was the end of love's chapter. A husband buried, a wife lost, and all the memories folded neatly into prayer and ritual. There were women who wore black until their hair turned gray, men who lived the rest of their days beside an empty chair. But others found their hearts whispering again. Not loudly, not at first, but gently, like spring pushing through snow. Remarriage was not uncommon. Life had to go on. Fields still needed tending. Children still needed raising. A household couldn't run itself. And sometimes, in the quiet companionship of another who had also known loss, something tender grew. Second chances didn't always look like young love. There were no stolen glances behind barn doors, no secret letters. This love was slower, quieter, built not on wonder, but on understanding. A widow and a widower might meet at the market, talk over bread and chores, share memories, not flirtation, and still feel something shift, a comfort, a recognition, a warmth. Of course, not everyone approved. Some whispered that it was too soon, that it was disloyal, that one love should be enough. But love, when it returns after grief, doesn't erase the past. It honors it by daring to begin again. Not everyone got a second chance, but those who did and took it often found something rare. A love not rushed, but rooted. Not fiery, but steady. And that, too, is love. Perhaps the bravest kind, wooing at the market square. If castles had courtyards and nobles had ballrooms, the villagers had the market square. It wasn't grand. There were no chandeliers or polished floors, just dusty stone underfoot, booths made of wood and linen, and the hum of barter and chatter from sunrise to midday. But love, like laughter, finds its places. And in the heart of every town, beneath baskets of apples and barrels of salted fish, hearts began to stir. The market was where everything happened: news, trade, gossip, and glances. It was the rhythm of the village. People gathered with baskets on their hips and coins wrapped in cloth. But in between the business of bread and barley, eyes met, and often something began. A boy might linger too long near the baker's stall, pretending to inspect loaves while watching the miller's daughter choose flour. A girl might pause at the flour cart, fingers brushing over petals, waiting for him to notice. And when he did, they smiled, briefly, as if it were nothing.
But it wasn't nothing.
There was no privacy at the market, but there was proximity, the kind that allowed for accidental meetings. "Oh, you're here again. I didn't know you liked plums. Let me carry that." All spoken casually, all carefully rehearsed in their minds before they dared to speak. Sometimes there were gifts, a ribbon tied around a bunch of herbs, a carved trinket slipped into a basket. Nothing extravagant, just enough to say, "I see you." And sometimes that was enough. Their courtship unfolded slowly between the stalls, between errands, between glances. One market day at a time. Not every market flirtation became a marriage. Some faded like the afternoon sun, but others became stories passed down for generations. Because love doesn't need chandeliers. Sometimes it just needs a place to linger. Romance during festivals and fairs. If the market square was the heartbeat of everyday life, then the festival was its dream. For a few days each year, perhaps once in spring, again in autumn, the world felt lighter. Streets were swept, flags were strung between buildings, musicians tuned their lutes, and the air buzzed with a sweetness that made even the most sensible hearts believe that something wonderful could happen. It was during these festivals that romance felt possible for everyone. Work paused, chores waited, and people gathered, dressed in their best, cheeks pink from excitement, laughter rising like bells over the rooftops. There was food, music, dancing, games, bonfires, and somewhere in the middle of it all, two people locking eyes. For many, this was their only chance. a farmhand who rarely left the fields, a girl who spent most days behind her mother's loom, a widow who hadn't smiled in months. During the festival, they met in the glow of lantern light, under banners of gold and crimson. Everything felt softened, time slowed, and the rules of daily life, for just a little while, loosened their grip. He might ask her to dance, hands touching, uncertain, over the flicker of music. She might offer him a drink, a bite of honeyed cake, a smile that meant something more. And when the sun dipped low and the stars stepped in, it all felt enchanted.
There were love stories that began at the fair. That lasted. That led to marriages, children, homes built with hands that first met beneath ribbons and lanterns.
But even when they didn't last, when the romance was just for the night, just for the dance, it still mattered. Because it reminded them all that life was more than duty. That hearts, even tired ones, could still flutter. And that love, however brief, still belonged to them, what they wore to impress. Love doesn't always begin with words. Sometimes it begins with what we choose to wear when we know we'll be seen. In the medieval world, clothing was more than function. It was message, it was hope. It was a quiet question that whispered, "Will they notice me today?" For nobles, the choices were elaborate. A velvet cloak in deep blue, stitched with silver thread. Gowns lined with fur or trimmed with pearl. Tunics dyed with rare colors, scarlet, emerald, indigo, meant not just beauty, but wealth, status, availability. A man might wear a ring turned outward to show he was free. A woman might let her hair fall loose, soft around her shoulders, signaling she had not yet taken vows or husbands. But even in humbler homes, even among those who owned only 2 dresses or 1 good pair of boots, effort was made. A girl might spend the morning pressing the creases from her apron, weaving a small braid into her hair, tying a ribbon that had been saved all year. A boy might wash his tunic twice, fix the worn stitching at the neck, shine his boots until they gleamed just enough.
To impress wasn't to boast. It was to say, in the gentlest way, I care, I hope, I see you.
And people noticed. A blush as someone walked past. A comment. Casual, but careful. That's a fine cloak. New shoes? Is that your mother's brooch? Compliments wrapped in modesty, but brimming with meaning. Sometimes, 2 people wore their finest just to pass one another at church, or to cross paths in the marketplace, or to sit near each other during the festival. The clothing didn't make love appear, but it invited it. It opened the door, and often it was enough to begin, because everyone, everywhere wants to be seen. Medieval hygiene, or lack of it. Love, for all its dreams and poetry, still had to live in the real world. And the real world, especially in the medieval era, didn't always smell like roses. Hygiene then was different. Water was precious. Hot water, even more so. And though people weren't as filthy as legends suggest, they weren't exactly fresh by modern standards. A bath wasn't a daily ritual. It was a rare event, a luxury, sometimes even a celebration. Villagers bathed in rivers when the weather allowed. Nobles had wooden tubs dragged into their chambers, filled bucket by tired servants. Herbs were often added, lavender, rosemary, mint, not just for scent, but to soothe the skin and mask whatever lingered. Soap existed, though it was rough. Made from animal fat and ash, it scrubbed, but wasn't gentle. And yet, people still tried. They washed their hands and faces. They combed their hair. They changed linen undergarments more often than outer clothes. Clean linen, after all, could make even the most worn tunic feel fresh. And when it came to love, hygiene mattered. A young man might rinse in the river before the midsummer dance. A girl might pluck sweet-smelling herbs to tuck in her sleeves, her braid, her bodice. Tooth powders were made from crushed mint and salt. Chewing parsley or cloves before speaking to a suitor? Common practice. They did what they could. Perfumes were used by the wealthy, oils pressed from flowers and spices, a dab on the wrist. A scent carried softly through a room. Not overpowering, just enough to make someone turn their head. Because even in a world without plumbing or toothpaste or soap that came in pastel bars, people still cared. They still wanted to feel clean, to be seen as beautiful, to be wanted, and somehow they were. Love songs and lutes. Before letters could fly through the air and voices could cross oceans in seconds, love was often sung. In the flicker of candlelight, beneath moonlit windows, or in the corners of grand halls where tapestries softened the cold stone, music became the way hearts spoke when mouths stayed silent. The lute was common. Its curved wood body, its soft strings, plucked gently by calloused fingers, held more emotion than many dared to speak. A song played well could say everything. I miss you. I want you. I love you. And sometimes, goodbye. There were ballads for every kind of love. For the knight who left his heart behind in a lady's chamber. For the village boy who dreamed of a girl he could never reach. For a wife who waited by the window as the war dragged on. Stories wrapped in melody, passed from voice to voice, tavern to castle, field to firelight. The songs weren't always original. Most were shared, borrowed, reshaped. A familiar tune with a new name slipped in, a line rewritten to fit the moment. Sometimes they were grand, with metaphors of stars and oceans. Other times, they were as simple as a line repeated, "Come back to me." And yet, they endured. A boy might sing under a balcony, not because he expected the girl to come down, but because he hoped she was listening. A girl might hum while she spun wool, the rhythm of her love stitched quietly into every verse. Even those who could not sing carried these songs in their hearts, like soft shields. Not everyone received a love song, but everyone, at some point, remembered one, because music, like love, lingers. Even after the last note fades, gender roles in courtship. In the medieval world, love didn't always begin with a question. Often it began with expectation. He was to pursue. She was to wait. That was the story, told again and again, in ballads, in sermons, in whispers between mothers and daughters. A man showed interest. A woman showed virtue. That was the dance. A young man was expected to lead. To court boldly, but with restraint. To speak with care, act with honor, and offer protection before affection. His role was to declare his intent, to visit, to bring gifts, to seek permission. His bravery was measured not just in battle, but in the courage it took to ask, to try, to hope. A young woman, meanwhile, was expected to be modest, to lower her eyes, to let herself be chosen. Her power was quieter, but not less. She had to navigate the space between being noticed and being judged. Too eager, and she was questioned. Too cold, and she was passed by. So she smiled at the right time, answered slowly, gave just enough warmth to encourage, never too much to shame. Her role was to be wanted, but not to want too openly. It sounds simple, but it wasn't, because behind these roles were real people, full of nerves, full of longing, and not everyone fit the mold. There were girls who dared to speak first, who dropped a flower knowing he would pick it up, who wrote letters when they shouldn't, and boys who stumbled through shyness, who fumbled their words, who weren't the bold ones at all, but the ones who waited too. Sometimes the rules bent. A woman of higher status might choose her husband. A clever girl might guide the courtship from behind a veil of modesty. A boy with no title might win a heart with nothing but kindness.
And when that happened, something real could begin.
Because love, true love, has never cared much for roles. It notices the quiet ones, the soft ones, the ones who don't always know what to say, but feel it all the same. So while the rules of courtship may have drawn the outlines, it was the people who colored them in. And sometimes, they colored outside the lines. Long-distance love, letters on horseback. Some love stories had distance stitched into them from the start. A young man sent away to war, a merchant traveling for trade, a noble daughter promised to someone in a far-off shire. Whatever the reason, love was sometimes asked to stretch across hills, forests, rivers, and time. There were no phones, no messengers that arrived in moments, only letters and the horses that carried them. To write was to wait. A single letter might take days, weeks, or even months to arrive. It passed through hands, through danger, through storms and roadblocks. And even if it survived the journey, there was no guarantee it would be answered, or read, or welcomed. And still, they wrote. The lovers poured themselves onto parchment, not just news, but emotion. Descriptions of dreams, of quiet mornings, of memories still held close. There were pages stained with tears, with pressed flowers, with wax seals bearing initials that meant everything to the one receiving it. A girl might sleep with the letter beside her bed. A man might read it by firelight, 100 times over, knowing every word by heart. Sometimes they wrote without knowing if it would be returned. Sometimes they waited and waited until the seasons changed, and still, nothing came. But love, when stretched by longing, didn't always fade.
It deepened.
Ached, yes, but deepened. Because to love from far away is to love with faith, with patience, with quiet strength. And when at last a new letter arrived, or a figure appeared on the horizon, mud-spattered, tired, but smiling, the reunion felt like something out of legend. Because love that travels far to return home feels like a miracle. Elopements and scandal. Some loves didn't wait for permission. They didn't ask for blessings or bow to the quiet nod of a disapproving father. They ran. These were the lovers who couldn't bear the waiting, who couldn't survive another day apart, who heard no and took it as a challenge, not a wall. Their love didn't come with chaperones or blessings. It came with urgency, with bags packed at midnight, with horses saddled in silence, with hearts pounding like drums in the dark. They eloped, and when they did, the village awoke to whispers. She's gone. He took her. They ran off last night, before the sun came up. The scandal would follow swiftly. Mothers wringing their hands, fathers speaking in fury, neighbors leaning in with interest masked as concern. What they had done wasn't just romantic. It was rebellious. It broke rules, defied order. It said, "Our love matters more than your permission." Sometimes they married quickly. A priest in a distant village, a witness who asked no questions. The vows said in a hush, the rings simple, the kiss lingering with relief. But it wasn't always safe. Not every elopement ended in happiness. Some were found, brought back, separated by force, by shame, by law. Some fled only to discover that love without a home, without food, without support, was harder than they dreamed. Yet even the failures became legend. People spoke of the girl who climbed from her tower, of the boy who waited for her by the gate, of the two who disappeared into the woods and were never seen again. Whether the story ended in joy or heartbreak, it was always told with a flicker of wonder. Because elopement was more than escape. It was a statement. I choose you, over comfort, over safety, over everything. And in that choice, something timeless was born. Church rules on love and lust. In medieval life, the church was not simply part of the world, it was the world. It rang the hours, it set the calendar, it watched over birth, death, marriage, and sin. And when it came to love, and especially lust, the church had very clear opinions. Desire was not trusted. It was something to be tamed, to be confessed. It was often considered dangerous, especially when it stepped outside the bounds of marriage. A glance too long, a kiss too early, a touch outside of vows, these were not simply personal moments, they were spiritual risks. The church taught that love was good only when it was ordered. Marriage was a sacrament, sacred and binding. A husband and wife were meant to be companions, to bear children, and to serve God through their union. But even within marriage, physical pleasure was viewed with suspicion. Desire for desire's sake? That was something else entirely. Priests preached sermons about purity, about Eve's temptation and the weakness of the flesh. Confessionals became the place where lovers whispered their regrets, their slips, their questions. Was it wrong to feel this way? Was it sinful to want someone's touch? And yet, people still did. They loved. They longed. They touched when they shouldn't have. They found one another in hidden corners behind barns, in the cool dark of churches when no one was watching. They risked punishment, shame, even excommunication. Not because they didn't believe, but because they were human.
And love, when true, is hard to silence.
The rules were strict. No intimacy outside of marriage. No marrying close relatives, even distant cousins. No weddings during Lent or Advent. Even the timing and manner of intimacy within marriage was governed. Some acts were discouraged, others forbidden outright. The church had something to say about everything. Clergy themselves were expected to remain celibate. Monks and nuns took vows that severed them from the physical world. And when they fell in love anyway, when they broke those vows, the punishment was swift and often severe. But in quiet ways, even the church softened. A kindly priest might look the other way if two young people came to be wed too soon after their banns were announced. A confessor might offer gentle words instead of harsh judgment. There were clergy who understood that love and longing were not enemies of faith, but part of the same fragile human soul. Still, fear lingered. A girl might lie awake at night, wondering if her thoughts alone were sinful. A boy might avoid confession for weeks after a single kiss. And the guilt, often heavier than the act itself, shaped them. But even within that structure, love survived. Some couples married in secret. Some waited, longing stretched thin by the weight of rules. Others found quiet rebellion, in letters, in longing glances, in holding hands beneath cloaks during church processions. Because love doesn't always need permission. And lust, despite every sermon, never needed encouragement.
The church gave the rules, but people still lived.
And sometimes, when they were lucky, they found both. A love that honored heaven, and a desire that honored the heart, confession booths and crushed hearts. There was a kind of silence inside the stone walls of a church that could make even the loudest emotions feel small. The echo of footsteps, the soft creak of pews, candles flickering like tiny stars in the stillness. This was where the soul came to speak, and to surrender. Where thoughts, private, aching, unspoken, were finally put into words. And for many in the medieval world, especially those in love, there was no place more sacred or more terrifying than the confessional. The wooden booth was small, almost like a closet. Divided by a screen or a curtain, it offered anonymity but not escape. One side held the penitent, the other the priest, and between them, silence, waiting, expecting truth. Forgive me, Father. It always began the same. But what followed could vary wildly. A stolen kiss behind the chapel, a touch exchanged under the stars, a thought lingering too long, a name whispered in a dream. Sin, they called it, even when it felt like love. Young hearts especially came here burdened. They didn't always know what was wrong, but they knew what they'd been told. That to want someone's touch was dangerous. That to look at lips instead of the soul was temptation. That the racing of the heart might be a warning, not a promise. So they confessed, their voices low, their cheeks flushed. Boys admitted to thoughts they couldn't control. Girls spoke of desires they had never acted on, but still carried like stones in their pockets. Lovers who had slipped too far came with trembling hands, begging for forgiveness, for cleansing, for the hope that love could still be pure after what they'd done. And some came simply to mourn, to confess not a sin, but a heartbreak. There were those who had loved and lost, who had been promised, and then left behind. A girl whose betrothed married another. A boy whose letters went unanswered. A widow who still dreamed of a voice she would never hear again. And though heartbreak was not a sin, it still felt heavy enough to confess. Because where else could they go? The priest would listen. Sometimes with stern silence, sometimes with warmth. The response depended on the man. Some clergymen saw only the rules, lines not to be crossed. Others saw the people, their frailty, their sincerity, their hope. For penance, they were given prayers. Hail Marys, Our Fathers, walks to sacred wells. Some were told to fast, others to avoid the one they longed for. And some were simply told to let go. But letting go isn't easy when love has taken root. It isn't easy when the person you're told to stay away from is the only one who's ever made you feel seen. The hardest confessions were the quiet ones, the ones where nothing had been done, but everything had been felt, where no vow was broken, and yet the heart felt guilty just for wanting more, wanting closeness, wanting to matter to someone else more than to God. And still, they returned, week after week, with new thoughts, new dreams, the same ache. Some confessed out of habit, others in tears. A few stopped coming altogether, overwhelmed by shame or convinced that their love made them unworthy of grace. But most came because, somewhere deep down, they hoped that if they spoke the feeling aloud, it would hurt less. It didn't always. For some, the confessional became a place of grief, of secrecy, of longing wrapped in guilt. But for others, it became something gentler, a ritual of surrender, a place to remember that they were still human, still growing, still forgiven. And over time, many learned to separate the feeling from the shame. They began to understand that love, even imperfect, wasn't something to be crushed. That desire, though complicated, wasn't always evil. That heartbreak wasn't something to apologize for. It was something to survive. Because behind every confession was a story of a girl who gave her heart too freely and now carried silence where a promise used to live. Of a boy who believed every glance meant forever, only to be left alone with a name he could no longer speak aloud. Of a woman who married without love and dreamed of what could have been. Of a man who was never allowed to say who he loved and buried his truth under years of dutiful silence. The confessional heard it all. And while it couldn't fix what was broken, it held space for what remained. Hope. Hope that hearts could mend. Hope that love, someday, might come without fear. Hope that feeling deeply was not a flaw, but a sign of life.
So they knelt, whispered, cried, hoped.
And when they walked back into the sunlight, something small had shifted. Maybe not the longing, maybe not the outcome, but the weight of it, the shape of it, the way it sat on the heart. Because sometimes, even when love cannot be returned, it still deserves to be spoken. Astrology and love predictions. Long before dating advice filled books or love was tested by personality quizzes, people turned their hearts to the sky. The stars, they believed, held answers. In the medieval world, astrology wasn't just for kings and mystics. It was woven into daily life, into planting and prayer, illness and fate. And when it came to love, it was the stars they trusted most. A birth chart could reveal a soul's hidden nature. The position of Venus might explain why a girl couldn't stop thinking about someone forbidden. The moon in a certain house might signal longing or loss, or a love soon to arrive on horseback just before the first frost. It was hope, written in constellations. Villagers might ask the traveling astrologer to cast a chart, scratched with charcoal on parchment, or drawn in the dirt with a stick. Will I marry this year? Will he come back? Will my love last? And with careful eyes and practiced hands, the astrologer would look to the stars as if their silence contained secrets meant only for the waiting heart. Noble families consulted them too. A lord might delay a wedding if Mercury was in retrograde. A daughter's marriage might hinge on an auspicious moon. The union of two signs, fire and water, air and earth, could be used to bless or to doubt a match. For lovers, astrology offered comfort. It made feelings feel fated. It made longing feel like destiny. If love wasn't returned, perhaps the stars weren't aligned. If it was, perhaps it was written all along. And so, they watched the skies, read the patterns, wished on stars, and in doing so, they believed, perhaps more than they feared, that love, like the constellations, had its place. And when the stars were kind, it found its way, love potions and herbal magic. In quiet corners of villages, where the herbs hung dry above smoky hearths, and the air smelled of mint and thyme, love was stirred into pots and whispered over like a secret spell. Not everyone trusted fate to do the work. Some turned to plants, to roots, to magic passed down through generations not in books, but in murmured recipes and soft instructions given at twilight. A pinch of rosemary to spark affection, a few crushed rose petals to open the heart. A sliver of apple soaked in honey to make a name linger sweetly on the tongue. Women, mostly older, mostly quiet, knew which herbs made the heart race and which calmed the nerves of a girl too nervous to speak her love aloud. They called it healing. They called it help. But everyone knew it was about love. The kind you wanted. The kind you couldn't have. The kind that needed a little encouragement. Some believed, truly. They drank the potions carefully, slowly, as if each sip could carry a dream into someone else's chest. Others laughed and tried anyway. Hope, after all, has never needed much reason. There were charms too, bundles tied with red thread, worn beneath a dress or tucked into a pocket. Lavender for sweetness, sage for strength, a clove of garlic to keep rivals away. Not all of it worked. Most of it didn't. But belief, even without proof, was often enough. And sometimes, just sometimes, a girl would smile differently the day after the potion was taken. A boy would speak more gently, more curiously. A name that had once passed by unnoticed would begin to glow, just slightly. And whether it was the herbs or the heart, no one could say. But the feeling stayed. Because love, like magic, is often made of little things. A leaf, a whisper, a wish, and the willingness to believe. Superstitions around marriage. Marriage was never just about vows and rings and feasts. It was surrounded by beliefs, fears, and fragile rituals whispered from one generation to the next like warnings wrapped in lace. A bride couldn't see the groom on the morning of the wedding, or the union would be cursed with sorrow before it even began. She had to wear something old for memory, something new for hope, something borrowed for love, and something blue to keep away envy and misfortune. If she tripped on the threshold, it was a sign. Some said of death, some said of disappointment. No one really knew, but everyone watched. Rain on a wedding day was either a blessing or a punishment, depending on who you asked and how the clouds had rolled in. Bread must be broken cleanly, or the marriage would break unevenly too. An owl seen on the wedding night meant secrets. A spider in the bride's veil meant fortune. A cracked mirror near the bed meant betrayal. Everything meant something. Superstitions held tight to the hems of wedding gowns and crept into the corners of wedding halls. Mothers clutched charms. Fathers crossed themselves. Friends tied knots in corners of cloth to protect the couple from jealous eyes. There were herbs to hang above the doorway, shoes to place by the bed, coins to tuck into shoes and pockets to ensure that poverty would never follow them home. Some couples followed every rule. Some broke them and held their breath. And when things went wrong, when the harvest failed, or a child fell ill, or a husband grew distant, people whispered not about fate or fault, but about the wedding day. She forgot the sprig of rosemary. He dropped the ring. They married when the moon was low, and just like that, love became tangled with ritual. It wasn't always fair. It wasn't always true. But it was everywhere. Because when hearts are fragile, people reach for anything to protect them. Even shadows, even stories, even the shape of a cloud on a Tuesday morning. And in that reaching, they made their own kind of magic. Not spells, not charms, just hope.
The influence of the moon on romance.
They watched the moon like it was a secret messenger, quiet and glowing, always changing and always returning. And they believed it had power over the heart just as it had over the tides and the fields and the rising of bread. When the moon was full, they said love would bloom faster, kisses would linger longer, and dreams would carry names not yet spoken. A waxing moon meant beginnings, good for asking, good for hoping, good for planting both seeds and feelings. A waning moon warned of things slipping away, passion, promises, warmth. Lovers waited for the right phase before making a move. Some waited for the silver curve to grow, afraid to speak during its dark retreat, as if the moon's light carried courage and without it, everything might falter. Weddings were planned according to the moon. If a couple married under a bright moon, it was said their love would glow even in hard times. But if they married in shadow, in the dark of the month, something would always feel hidden between them. The moon was blamed for restlessness, for sudden longing, for words spoken that couldn't be taken back. Girls were told not to walk alone under the full moon, not because of danger from the world, but from their own hearts. Too open, too soft, too ready to fall. And boys felt it too, though they rarely said so. They stood outside homes at night, watching the moon through trees, thinking of her, thinking of what they wished they'd said. The moon saw it all, the silent goodbyes, the quiet tears, the slow reaching of one soul toward another across distance. And though it never answered, never turned or nodded or sent a sign, it kept shining, gentle, constant. The moon didn't promise love, but it reminded people to believe in things that returned, even after disappearing. And that was enough.
Medieval love poems that make no sense.
They tried, bless them. They really did, quill in hand, heart wide open, eyes turned toward the moon, or a girl who walked past once and never looked back. And they poured out lines they believed were brilliant, beautiful, eternal. But oh, how strange some of those poems turned out. Your eyes are like two fish swimming in a silver bowl, one line read, and perhaps that was romantic then, or at least original. Your breath is like warm goat's milk on a winter morning, said another, and someone somewhere must have swooned. They wrote about hair like silk, yes, but also about hair like hay. About hands soft as lambskin and teeth white as pickled onions. And somehow, this was meant to seduce. It didn't always rhyme. It didn't always make sense. But it always came from a place of deep, awkward feeling. A knight might sit under a tree for hours, scratching out verses onto bark or parchment, comparing his beloved to roses, birds, fire, snow, cheese, rainstorms, or saints. Sometimes all in the same stanza. And the ladies, too, wrote their own replies. One poem found in a convent spoke of a man's voice being as soft as mashed peas. Another praised a lover's shoulders as being wide as a door to the Lord's barn. And yet, behind every odd line, every strange simile, was something real. The desire to be noticed, to be remembered, to be understood. Because even when the poem was clumsy, the love behind it wasn't. It was earnest. It was hopeful. It was trying its best. And sometimes, that's all love is. A strange poem, a weird comparison, a metaphor that almost works, and a heart saying, in its own confusing way, I see you, I want you. Please smile when you read this. Awkward wedding feasts. The vows were spoken, the kiss was given, the church bells had rung, and the couple, ready or not, was now bound together. And so came the feast. Loud, long, overflowing with food, drink, music, and more than a few uncomfortable silences. Medieval wedding feasts were not elegant affairs with assigned seating and dainty speeches. They were boisterous, chaotic, and deeply social events, meant not just to celebrate the union, but to display the families, their wealth, their alliances, and sometimes their unresolved tension. The bride, still adjusting to her new dress and new name, sat at the head of the table beside a man she might barely know. Her new husband might be charming, or quiet, or far more interested in the roast than in her. Around them gathered relatives, neighbors, curious onlookers, and distant cousins no one had spoken to in years, but who always came when wine was promised. Everyone watched the newlyweds. Every laugh, every glance, every bite of food shared, or not. People whispered if she didn't smile enough. They gossiped if he didn't hold her hand. They read meaning into every movement. And for two people who might have only met a few weeks ago, or whose hearts still hadn't caught up with their signatures, it could feel like sitting on a stage instead of at a table. Then came the food. Platters of meats, roasted pig, cold fowl, sometimes peacock with the feathers reattached just for show, alongside stews and bread, butter, and boiled vegetables. And while the food was often rich, it wasn't always good, undercooked, overseasoned, or cold from being carried too far. The guests nodded politely. Some complained loudly. Someone always dropped a leg of something on the floor. And then there was the mead. So much mead. Enough to make even the most graceful uncle sing out of tune, or attempt a dance better suited to a man half his age. The drinks loosened tongues, but not always in the best way. Old arguments resurfaced. Former suitors gave one too many toasts. A jealous sibling said something sharp. A father-in-law laughed a little too hard when asked about dowries.
And still, the music played.
Minstrels strummed lutes or fiddled, depending on what the family could afford. They sang of love, of harvests, of battle. Songs that were meant to lift the mood, but sometimes just made things stranger. One moment, a sweet ballad about eternal devotion. The next, a loud drinking song involving goats. No one seemed to know which one came next. Games were played, sometimes involving bread, sometimes involving blindfolds, sometimes involving things better left unnamed, and the couple was often forced to participate, even if all they wanted was a quiet corner and a moment to breathe. And then came the speeches. There was no microphone, no gentle clinking of a glass, just someone standing up and speaking, whether invited or not. A brother telling stories from childhood that made everyone cringe. A priest offering solemn reflections that went on far too long. A friend who'd had 3 mugs too many, declaring loudly that he always knew they'd end up together, even if no one else did. The bride smiled through it all. The groom nodded, laughed where expected, wiped sweat from his brow. Because this was tradition. This was joy. This was what people did, even if it didn't feel joyful every second. But within the awkwardness, the spills, the teasing, and the mismatched expectations, something real could happen. They shared bread from the same plate. They laughed at the same off-key song. They leaned closer to whisper something only the other could hear. And maybe, just maybe, they began to feel not like strangers seated beside each other, but like partners.
Because awkwardness is human.
And a feast, like a marriage, doesn't need to be perfect. It needs to be shared. The role of animals in love gifts. In a world without flower shops, chocolate boxes, or handwritten valentines slipped into coat pockets, people found other ways to say, "I love you." And sometimes, strange as it may seem now, they said it with animals. Not as pets, not as meat, but as messages. Because in the medieval world, animals were more than companions or tools. They were symbols. And in the language of love, they could say what words could not. A nobleman might offer a hunting hound to the lady who had captured his heart. Not just a dog, but a promise. A trained companion. A creature of loyalty and instinct. To give a hound was to say, "You are worth my trust. You are worth something rare." And if she accepted it, if she let the animal sit by her feet or sleep beneath her window, it was known, without a single word, that something had begun. Sometimes it was a falcon, sleek, wild, untamable, a gift of great value, meant only for those who mattered. A falcon said, "I admire you, I respect you, I see your strength." It was not a gift given lightly, and when it was received, it meant the world. In villages, the gifts were simpler, but just as heartfelt. A boy might bring a rabbit, soft and warm, with ears like petals and a heartbeat that fluttered, or a lamb, barely old enough to walk, tucked gently in his arms. It wasn't grand, but it was honest. A creature still learning the world, just like the love it represented. Sometimes it was a kitten. Not for catching mice, but for curling into the crook of a neck. For purring in the quiet of a lonely evening. A cat tied with a ribbon, placed gently on a doorstep, could say, "I care for you. I want to make you smile. I thought of you today." There were gifts with humor, too. A chicken with a ribbon on its foot, delivered with a smile and a note. "You've scrambled my heart." Or a duck waddling up to the front steps with no message at all, just a glance from the sender across the square that meant everything. Not everyone understood. Some laughed, some thought it silly, but those who received the gifts rarely forgot them. Because the animal came with more than fur or feathers. It came with meaning. A dove meant peace. A deer meant grace. A dog meant loyalty. A goat, chaotic, bold, meant courage. Each animal was chosen not for its use, but for what it made the heart feel. And perhaps most beautiful of all, the gift didn't wilt. It didn't dry up or fade away. It lived. It breathed. It followed its new owner through seasons and across thresholds. It ate from their hand, slept at their feet, learned their voice. The love might pass. The sender might marry another, but the gift remained. There are stories, quiet ones, half-remembered, of women who cared for a dove long after the man who gave it had gone. Of men who fed a cat for years because she once laughed at how it curled in her lap. Of love that didn't last, but left something behind that still purred or barked or blinked slowly in the firelight. Because sometimes the truest love doesn't speak, it meows. Bizarre dating customs by region. Love, for all its softness and longing, wasn't always subtle. Sometimes it was strange, unusual, unexpected. Because across the medieval world, courtship looked different from village to village, valley to coast. What was romantic in one place was laughed at in another. And still, every region believed this was the way love was meant to begin. In parts of rural Wales, a man would carve a wooden spoon by hand, a love spoon, shaped with swirls, hearts, keys, or knots, and present it to the girl he admired. It was simple, beautiful, and oddly practical. If she accepted it, she accepted him. And if she didn't, the spoon stayed in his pocket, heavy as regret. In the cold corners of the north, Icelandic boys once proved their love by walking barefoot across snow-covered fields to their lover's home. Bare feet, frozen ground, a heart that burned anyway. Some arrived with bloodied souls. Some never made it. But those who did were often met at the door not with pity, but with pride. In Austria, during harvest season, a girl might slip an apple slice into her armpit during a long day in the fields. By the end of the day, warm and worn, she'd hand it to the boy she fancied. If he ate it without flinching, without comment, it meant he truly loved her, or was willing to suffer for her. And somehow, that was enough. In parts of France, during midsummer festivals, lovers would sit across from each other by firelight and throw questions back and forth, rapid and sharp, until one stumbled or blushed or laughed. It wasn't about answers. It was about rhythm, about connection, about watching someone's eyes when they were caught off guard. And in some sleepy English towns, young women would sleep with sprigs of rosemary beneath their pillows to dream of the man they were destined to marry. If they dreamed clearly, they were told to speak no one's name the next day, not even his. To speak, it would scare him away. In the Alps, some lovers declared themselves with bells, small carved cowbells strung on ribbon and left at the edge of a window. A soft clang at midnight meant, "Come find me. I'm ready. I choose you." And there were stranger customs still. Love declared by gifts of onions, by stolen shoes, by chasing one another through muddy courtyards, laughter echoing like church bells. Odd to us now, but sincere then. Because all of it, every ritual, every strange tradition, was an attempt to say what hearts never quite learned to say out loud.
I see you. I want you. Will you take my hand?
Even if that hand comes with a spoon, a bell, or a warm apple slice. Medieval pickup lines. Yes, really? They didn't have dating apps or clever text messages, no emojis, no carefully curated profiles, but that didn't stop them from trying to impress each other with words. And oh, how they tried. In the great halls and cobbled streets of the medieval world, there were still brave souls who looked someone in the eye and said something charming, or at least, they hoped it was. "Fair lady, your eyes outshine the blessed candles of the cathedral," was one that came often, especially from younger knights in training, their armor still too loose and their confidence a little too big. It rarely worked. But sometimes, she smiled. "Wouldst thou lend me thy hand? For I have lost mine heart, and need a guide to find it." Sweet, dramatic, hopelessly rehearsed. It was said beneath castle balconies and across mead-stained tavern tables. It made girls blush or laugh or walk away, but never forget. Then there were the bolder lines, from traveling minstrels and cheeky stable boys. "If beauty were measured in stars, I would have to build thee a sky of your own." Or worse, "My lady, if kisses were bread, I'd feast for eternity on thy lips." Sometimes poetry, sometimes perilously close to nonsense, and still, they kept trying. Because even then, humor was hope in disguise. Flirting wasn't about perfection. It was about risking a word, just one, and waiting for the look that followed. A raised eyebrow, a turned head, a smile tucked into a sleeve. Women had their ways too. They might say, "If you truly know the way to my heart, tell me how many paces it is from here to the chapel." Or, "A man who speaks so sweet must surely have honey on his tongue, but let me hear more before I believe it." Wit was flirtation's favorite tool. Not beauty, not wealth, not even bravery, but quickness, lightness, the ability to make someone pause and smile. Were they silly? Often. Were they too much? Sometimes. Did they work? Sometimes yes, sometimes not at all. But the truth was, the line didn't matter as much as the courage behind it.
Because every pickup line was really just this. I saw you. I wanted to speak. And I was willing to be foolish, just for the chance you might speak back.
And in that, perhaps, is the most romantic thing of all, historical breakups and betrayals. Love, even in its sweetest form, does not always last. And in the medieval world, where vows were sacred and promises often spoken more by families than hearts, breakups didn't always come with closure. But they came all the same. They came with silence, with letters never answered, with a name that slowly stopped being spoken aloud. Sometimes with nothing more than a single glance at a feast, one that used to mean everything, and now meant nothing at all. There are stories, quiet and half-forgotten, of lovers who planned to run away but never did. Of a girl who waited with her bag packed beneath her cloak, watching the road, waiting for the sound of hooves, and he never came. Maybe he was stopped. Maybe he changed his mind. Maybe he loved her, but not enough to give up the life waiting for him beyond her window. And so she unpacked, slowly, carefully, as if undoing a dream thread by thread. She never spoke of him again. There was the nobleman who promised to marry the baker's daughter, told her she was his muse, his joy, his future. But when his father returned from war, he was reminded of duty, of land, of names. Within weeks, he was engaged to a baron's niece, and the baker's daughter? She watched him pass by every morning, with new silk on his arm and a new voice in his ear. He never looked back, but she never forgot the sound of his laughter in her kitchen. Some breakups came with betrayal. A woman married off to one brother after having fallen in love with the other. A man who courted two sisters at once, only to choose neither. Or worse, chose one, then returned years later to the other, as if the heart could simply be rewritten like a scroll. There were letters stolen, secrets kept, jealous rivals who whispered lies just loud enough to be believed. And love, so delicate, couldn't always survive the noise. Infidelity happened too. Husbands with mistresses, wives with wandering eyes, lovers who swore loyalty beneath moonlight, only to forget it by morning. And though divorce was rare, heartbreak was not. A betrayed lover might carry on with grace, but inside, the wound never truly closed. Some took revenge. Quiet revenge. A woman who burned the letters he once wrote, then married his cousin out of spite. A man who sent back every gift she had ever given, returned by courier with no message. Sometimes cruel, sometimes necessary, always final. But not every heartbreak ended in bitterness. There were couples who drifted, who changed, who once danced by the fire and now couldn't find their rhythm. They sat across tables in silence, shared beds without sharing anything at all. And in time, the love faded, not with a scream, but with a sigh. He no longer asked about her day. She no longer waited up. And though no one saw it end, it ended all the same. And yet, not all endings were tragic. Some were honest. Two people meeting beneath the trees where they first kissed, hands held, eyes full of history, and simply saying, "It's no longer what it was." And they parted not with anger, but with gratitude. For what had been, for who they had been, for the way love had lived between them, if only for a season. Because even in a time when feelings were quiet and rules were loud, hearts still broke. And when they did, it wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was soft. Sometimes barely visible.
A girl who stopped singing.
A boy who stopped visiting the market. A woman who walked with her head a little lower.
A man who stayed up later than usual, long after the candles burned low.
They mourned in silence. They healed slowly. Some found love again. Some never did. But all of them remembered. Because love, even when lost, leaves a shape behind. A place where something once grew. A part of the heart forever marked, not with bitterness, but with memory. And that too is love, even when it ends, alone at the tapestry. Loneliness in history. Not every love story ends in heartbreak. Some never begin. And for many in the medieval world, love wasn't a chapter in their story. It was only a dream, stitched along the edges. There were women who sat for hours in stone chambers, weaving tapestries that stretched wall to wall, hands moving with grace and habit, eyes drifting to the window where nothing changed. Their lives were quiet, structured, filled with duty, but inside, they longed. Not always for passion, but for presence. For someone who noticed the silence between words. For someone who asked how they were and waited to hear the truth. They weren't mistreated, not always, but they were alone in a way that could not be named. Not widowed, not abandoned, just unseen. And there were men who rode for days, weeks, across fields and hills with no one but a sword for company. Soldiers who returned not to lovers, but to empty homes. Farmers who worked the land with no voice waiting at the door. Monks who had chosen silence, but still dreamt of laughter. They had no letters, no names written in secret, no glance across a crowded square. They lived, day after day, in quiet repetition. In the ache of something missing, they never spoke aloud. Loneliness wore many shapes. The married woman whose husband never looked at her the way he looked at the sky. The stable boy who loved a noble he could never touch. The girl sent to a convent at 12, told to give her heart to God, but who still hid pressed flowers between the pages of her prayer book. It didn't always come from cruelty. Often, it came from distance, from lives chosen by others, from paths set long before hearts had the chance to speak. They smiled at feasts, they danced at weddings, they lit candles, they kissed cheeks. But in quiet moments, behind tapestries, in corridors, in fields, in cloisters, there it was. The emptiness, the wondering. Is this it? Is this all? Will no one ever see the parts of me I keep hidden? And perhaps the saddest part of all was how well they hid it. Because the world did not ask about loneliness. It asked for obedience, for patience, for service. And so they folded their ache into routine, into prayer, into poems they never read aloud. But loneliness doesn't stay quiet forever. It finds its way into art, into songs sung too slowly, into tapestries with skies that feel too wide, or couples woven too far apart, into carvings where one figure looks away, into lullabies sung without children, into gardens planted in circles, meant for walking alone. Yet even in that loneliness, there was beauty. Because people kept hoping. A woman might walk the same hallway for years, yet still glance up each time someone approached, wondering maybe today. A boy might dream of a face he'd never seen and still wake up smiling. Even in isolation, the heart still reached out. And sometimes, rarely, miraculously, someone reached back. A stranger passed through town and left a note. A new servant arrived and asked a real question. A friend, long forgotten, returned. And for a moment, the silence lifted. Not forever, not completely, but enough. Enough to remind them that loneliness wasn't failure. That being alone didn't mean being unloved. That their quiet hearts, their unshared thoughts, their whispered hopes, they still mattered. Because loneliness is not just the absence of company, it is the absence of understanding. And when someone, anyone sees you, truly sees you, something softens. Even if nothing changes, even if they leave, even if the tapestry remains unfinished. And so, throughout history, through shadowed halls and sunlit meadows, people walked alone. Not because they had no one, but because they were waiting, hoping, listening for a voice that called their name with meaning. And maybe it never came, but they still lived with grace, still fed the animals, still opened the shutters each morning, still walked the long road to chapel, still believed, because love may not have arrived, but the hope for it never left.
Nuns and monks. Love given to God.
They gave up the world for something they couldn't touch. They walked away from dances and weddings and whispered promises beneath windows. They chose silence, prayer, ritual, and stillness because they believed there was a deeper love waiting for them, one without flesh, one without longing. Glances across feast tables, one not bound by touch or time. Some were sent, some chose freely. Some entered with hearts already broken, and some with hearts still unformed. A girl of 15, hair braided tight, carrying no more than a name and a linen shift, stepped into the stone quiet of the abbey and tried not to cry when the gates closed behind her. A boy who had dreamed once of fields and laughter, and the sound of horses' hooves in the grass now rose every morning in a cell where the only sound was his own breath. They were told this was devotion, this was purpose, this was purity. And maybe it was, but they still felt, still remembered, still wondered. The prayers were long, the days carefully measured, the bells marking every moment of hunger, thought, and rest. There was beauty in it, the singing, the scent of wax and ink, the hush of candlelight before dawn, the way the world outside faded into nothing, and all that remained was God. But love doesn't leave just because it isn't named. Feelings don't disappear just because they aren't shared. A nun might pass another sister in the cloister and feel her heartbeat change. A monk might glance too long at a traveling scholar and spend weeks repenting thoughts he never spoke. They confessed quietly, trembling, not always because they had acted, often only because they had felt. And feeling was frightening, because they had made vows, because they had promised themselves to heaven, but they were still human, still soft, still made of the same ache as anyone else. And sometimes they fell in love, not always the kind that seeks to possess or kiss or hold, sometimes just the kind that wants to be near, to know, to witness. A sister who longed to hear another's voice, even when there were no words left to say. A brother who remembered the curve of a smile in the middle of a hymn. They never told. Or if they did, it was years later. In confessions that started as sin and ended as sorrow, not because the love had been wrong, but because it had never been allowed. Some carried that love quietly for the rest of their lives, praying for someone who would never know, writing lines in the margins of psalms that made no sense to anyone but them, burying their secret in gardens behind the cloister wall. Others left, ran, walked barefoot into the unknown, gave up their vows for something louder, messier, more human, and were judged, and were free, and were happier, or not. Because not all leaving leads to peace, and not all staying leads to pain. Some stayed and found joy, a joy not in romance but in rhythm, in giving, in silence, in knowing that their love had simply changed direction. It had not died. It had just risen like smoke, higher, unseen. Because devotion takes many shapes. Some love a person, some love a place, some love a purpose. And some give all their love to God, not because they do not desire, but because they desire so deeply that they wish to give it fully, completely, without return. And that too is love. And that too is beautiful. Even when it is quiet. Even when it is lonely. Even when no one else understands it. It matters. It is real. It endures.
Forbidden love. Across class and creed.
Love was never meant to follow rules. It never asked for permission. It bloomed where it shouldn't, crossed fences, slipped between locked doors, and in the medieval world, it did all of that while risking names, homes, status, and sometimes even lives. To love someone from the wrong class was to challenge the shape of the world itself, to break through the walls that separated stone from straw, silk from wool, Latin from silence. A noblewoman might fall for the stable hand, watching the way he touched the horses more gently than her father touched gold. And he might look at her not because of her dress or dowry, but because she laughed differently than the other ladies, because she once dropped a ribbon and didn't care to pick it up. But they could never speak it aloud. Not really. A glance here, a longer moment in the corridor, a hand brushing too close when passing a cup. Everything had to be hidden. Everything had to be sacred, because to be caught was to lose everything. A servant could be dismissed, disgraced. A lady could be sent to a convent, married off to someone twice her age in a distant province where no one knew her name. The world protected its order fiercely, and yet love didn't care. It whispered anyway, in kitchens, in stables, in gardens where no one looked. And sometimes it crossed not just class, but creed. A Christian boy and a Jewish girl, a Muslim merchant and the daughter of a scholar. They met in marketplaces, in shadows, in places where their gods might frown, but their hearts didn't. They knew the risks. They knew what had been said, what had been preached, what had been punished before. But still, they spoke. They listened. They touched hands behind stone walls. They loved not despite the difference, but within it. Not because it was easy, but because it was true. And sometimes, love made them brave. A knight who renounced his inheritance because he couldn't bear to live a lie. A girl who ran in the middle of the night, choosing heart over bloodline. A couple who converted not out of belief but out of devotion, not to a religion, but to each other. But many didn't run, couldn't. Many stayed, hid, watched from afar as the one they loved married another. They stood outside the chapel as bells rang for someone else's vows. They returned to kitchens, to fields, to silence, and carried the love like a wound that never healed. Forbidden love was not always tragic, but it was always fragile. It demanded more than courage. It demanded patience, secrecy, sacrifice. It was the kind of love that lived in letters never sent, in songs never sung, in memories that refused to fade. And even when it ended, it stayed. In the way a name was never spoken again, in the way a path was avoided, in the way a heart remained half full. But it was also beautiful, because it was real, because it chose feeling over fear, even if only for a moment, and because in a world built on borders, walls between people, between faiths, between names, this kind of love reached across, gently, bravely, unapologetically, and proved, if only in silence, that the heart is free.
Public shame and private sorrows.
Some heartbreaks happened in silence, but others were dragged into the daylight, exposed in the town square, whispered behind hands, echoed in the turning of heads and the pointing of fingers. In the medieval world, the line between private love and public judgment was thin, fragile, and often shattered without warning. A girl seen slipping from a doorway too early in the morning could find herself the subject of gossip before breakfast. A boy who looked too long at the wrong woman could be accused of dishonor. A letter found. A kiss caught. A rumor repeated. That's all it took. And once the eyes of the village turned on you, they didn't easily look away. Women suffered the worst. If she was unmarried and found with child, her name would be stripped of kindness. Her eyes would be avoided. Her shoulders would hunch beneath shame like a cloak too heavy to carry. Her father might stop speaking to her. Her mother might cry behind closed doors but say nothing aloud. Neighbors would mutter. Children would stare. She might be sent away. Or worse, she might be forced to stay. Walk the same streets, every day, with no one daring to meet her eyes. And yet, no one ever asked how much she had loved him, whether she had been misled or whether she had simply hoped too deeply. No one asked about the promises made in the dark, only about the rules broken in the light. Men were shamed too, though less visibly. A broken engagement, a failed courtship, a bride who changed her mind, or who was taken from him by war, duty, or someone wealthier. He would drink more, speak less, be told to move on. But something inside him stayed still. Some sorrows are quiet, but no less deep. There were public punishments. A girl made to stand barefoot on a stone, head uncovered, as the priest read her sins aloud. A boy whipped behind the chapel for courting a noble's daughter without permission. A couple separated by force, each told the other had moved on, both living the rest of their lives with the same name echoing inside them like a bell that would never stop ringing. The sorrow wasn't just in what was lost. It was in the way it was taken. The way something private, tender, real, imperfect but genuine, was turned into a spectacle, a lesson, an example. So others would not follow. But hearts do not follow rules. And sorrow, once planted, grows. A woman might smile for years, host dinners, attend mass, raise children, and never tell anyone that the love of her life was a boy she met one summer and lost before the leaves turned gold. A man might marry, work the land, build a house, and still dream of a girl who once tied a ribbon to his wrist and told him never to forget. And though they never spoke of it, it lived inside them. Sorrow does not disappear when ignored. It settles, deepens, learns to speak more softly, and some learn to live beside it. Not bitterly, not broken, just changed. They pour that love into their work, into their children, into songs, into poems no one reads, into prayers they whisper before sleep, into kindness. Because shame fades, but sorrow lingers. And even in a world that punished the heart for daring to feel, it could not erase the feeling itself. And so they carried it, with grace, with strength, with silence, with memory, secret messages and hidden letters. When love could not be spoken aloud, it was written, folded, hidden, slipped into pockets, between books, under bread, or inside the hem of a sleeve. It became a whisper on paper, a heartbeat in ink. Because in a world that punished the wrong kind of affection, that judged a glance, a touch, a breath too close, letters became the only way to say what the heart could no longer hold inside. A letter was a risk, a danger, a lifeline. It was proof. It was confession. And yet, they wrote anyway. A girl would stay up after the candles had been blown out, using the faint moonlight to guide her pen. Her fingers trembled not from fear, but from the weight of the words she dared to say. I think of you every morning. I dream of the way your voice sounds when you laugh. I remember the night you looked at me like I mattered. A boy would scribble on parchment meant for church records, borrowing ink from a brother who asked no questions. He didn't know how to write beautifully, but he knew how to write truth. I cannot breathe without thinking of you. I counted the days since you last touched my hand. My mother asks why I am quiet now, and I cannot tell her that your name is the only word I want to speak. The letters were folded small, sealed with wax or thread or nothing at all. Sometimes they were carried by friends who didn't understand. Sometimes by servants who understood too well. Sometimes they were tucked beneath pillows, left in barns, hidden under stones by the river where two lovers once met in the fading light. And the replies came, if they were lucky. Short, breathless, full of everything they couldn't say aloud. I wear the ribbon you gave me still, hidden in my sleeve. I kissed the flower you left in the chapel pew. I read your letter every night and pray you are safe and warm and still mine. They never signed their full names. Sometimes not at all. Just initials, just symbols. Just a pet name whispered only once in a hallway, now remembered forever. But not all letters reached their destination. Some were intercepted. Some were read aloud in front of fathers who turned red with rage. Some were burned, torn, mocked. And the writers never knew if it was rejection or ruin. But they kept writing, because to love in silence was unbearable. But to love with a voice, even a secret one, was hope. There were stories of entire courtships carried out through letters. Two people who never spoke in public, who passed in corridors like strangers, but who knew each other's hearts like scripture, who waited for a folded page with more desperation than a feast, more joy than a gift. Sometimes the letters were found years later, in the lining of a chest, in the pages of a forgotten book, in the walls of old homes, and they still pulsed with warmth, with longing, with the sweetness of stolen love that was never allowed to live in daylight. A nun wrote to a boy she had met once, before her vows, and kept writing every year on the day they first spoke. She never sent them, but she kept them, all 32, tied with ribbon, each one more tender than the last. A widow found a letter from her husband written before their wedding, hidden in the base of a candlestick he had carved. He had written, "If you are reading this, it means I never told you enough, that you were my peace." And sometimes the letters were not about great romance. Sometimes they were small, sweet. A boy thanking a girl for a smile that made him believe again. A girl writing one line over and over. I miss you. I miss you. I miss you. Letters gave shape to love when love had no place to live, when there were no weddings, no feasts, no permission, just two people with too much to say and nowhere to say it. So they wrote. And in doing so, they left something behind that even time could not erase. Ink fades, but feelings last. And there is something holy about a heart made visible in handwriting. Uneven, rushed, smudged, but true. Because in the end, all they wanted was to be remembered, to be known, to be loved, even quietly.
Even secretly.
Even just on a piece of paper that no one else would ever see when they came back from war. They never came back the same, not one of them. Whether they returned with medals or with scars, on horseback or limping, In the brightness of spring or the fog of autumn, they all came back changed. And those who waited, they changed too. Wives, sweethearts, sisters, mothers. They counted the days with quiet hearts and busy hands, praying with every sunrise that the war would not take the person they loved. But war always takes something, even from the ones who returned. Some came back whole in body, but shattered in silence. They didn't speak of what they saw, not because they couldn't remember, but because remembering hurt too much. A boy who had left laughing now stood in the doorway without smiling. A man who had promised to return with stories now only nodded when asked how it had been. They were surrounded by the familiar: food, firelight, the curve of a lover's shoulder. But they felt far from everything, as if some part of them had stayed on a battlefield and was never coming back.
And still, those who loved them tried.
A woman laid out her husband's old boots, cleaned and softened, even though he never wore them again. A girl who had waited 5 years for a soldier's return still kept the locket he gave her, even after she saw the way he looked past her now. He had survived, yes, but not all of him. There were joyful reunions too, of course. Moments when hearts burst open, a scream of recognition across a crowded road, arms thrown around shoulders that had once worn armor, lips pressed to foreheads as if to say, "I feared I would never feel you again." And for a little while it was enough. But even love had to learn how to live with what war had done. Some couples found each other all over again. Slowly, gently. A wife helping her husband sleep through the nights when his breathing turned to gasps. A man who kissed his wife's hand every morning like it was a prayer. They did not need to speak of it. They simply carried it together. But not every love survived. Some soldiers came home to find the world had moved on. A promised engagement broken. A house locked. A letter left on the table with a name crossed out and no return address. And though he had dreamed of her every night on the battlefield, she had learned how to live without him, or worse, believed him dead. There were women who waited and waited and waited, only to hear nothing at all. And when he finally returned, if he did, he looked at her like a stranger, and she looked back the same way. Because time does not always wait for love to catch up. There were children born while their fathers were gone, and when those fathers returned, they wept not with joy, but with guilt. Guilt for having missed the first laugh, the first step, the shape of a hand that did not yet recognize theirs. They tried to make up for it. But some things cannot be made up, only carried. War doesn't just change soldiers. It changes homes. It shifts the way a table feels. It changes the stories told by firelight. It makes silence louder. It turns joy into something fragile and grief into something shared. And yet, there was grace in the coming back, even when it hurt, even when it was awkward, even when it wasn't what anyone imagined. There was grace in the attempt, in the reaching, in the way two people who had once said goodbye could look at each other again and say, "We are not who we were, but I still love you. I want to learn you again. I want to stay." Some never got that chance. Some returned to graves, to empty beds, to names carved in stone and candles lit every Sunday. And in those moments, even surviving felt like failure. Because they came back, but the person they had survived for was gone. And still, life went on. The boots were polished, the wounds were wrapped. The letters were reread, the bread was baked, and love, though changed, though bruised, though quiet, remained. Not the love of before, but something new, something earned, something deeper. Because when they came back from war, they brought with them not just sorrow, but the need for tenderness, for patience, for someone to say, "I see what you carry, and I do not turn away." And that, too, was a kind of victory.
Not the kind sung by minstrels.
But the kind that lasts.
The secret language of flowers.
In a world where words could be dangerous and feelings forbidden, where eyes were watched and whispers carried weight, flowers became more than decoration. They became a language of their own. In the medieval world, love was often lived in silence, in glances, in restraint. But flowers allowed people to speak without being heard, to confess without being punished, to say everything while saying nothing at all. A single bloom, carefully chosen and quietly delivered, could carry more meaning than 100 letters. A rose wasn't just a rose. It was a message, a promise, a question, a beginning. If it was red, it meant desire, not the loud kind, but the kind that settled under the skin, that kept a person awake at night thinking of lips never kissed and words never said. A white rose meant purity, devotion, not untouched but undamaged, a heart held open, waiting, willing. A yellow flower might mean friendship or betrayal, depending on the eyes that saw it. A blue one meant longing, endless, deep, sad, like an ocean between souls. Lovers studied these meanings. They learned them in secret. They passed them to each other in the margins of prayer books or whispered beneath tapestries. A girl might tuck lavender into the basket of a boy passing by, and he would know she was thinking of him when she should have been sleeping. A man might place a single daisy on the chapel bench where a widow sat each morning, not to seduce her, but to say you are still seen, still beautiful, still here. There was time for courage, ivy for loyalty, violets for modesty, forget-me-nots for exactly what they sound like. And when words failed, when time was short or danger too near, lovers made bouquets, small, simple, often wild, and tied with ribbon or thread. And each one was a letter of its own. A sprig of rosemary with a touch of sage might mean I remember you, and I forgive you. A bloom of heather and a single fern might say I'm afraid, but I love you still. And sometimes the flowers were not sent to be read but to be kept, pressed between pages, worn close to the skin, or buried in the folds of a pillow, so that the scent of love would not fade even when everything else did. And it wasn't only lovers who spoke this way. Mothers gave chamomile to sons leaving for war. Sisters braided lilies into each other's hair before a long goodbye. Friends placed marigolds at the graves of those they once laughed with. Because love is not always romantic. Sometimes it's just care. Sometimes it's just grief. Sometimes it's just memory. And the flowers spoke for all of it. There were dangers too. A flower left on the wrong doorstep could spark rumors. A bouquet delivered in daylight might lead to questions no one was ready to answer. So they chose their timing carefully. Nightfall, market hour, festival days when everyone's hands were full and their eyes were elsewhere. Some grew their own flowers in secret gardens behind the walls of convents or in corners of estates where no one bothered to look. And they harvested their messages like poetry. Carefully, softly, intentionally. A woman who could not speak to the man she loved might still pass by and let a petal fall from her sleeve. He would see it. He would know. And that would be enough. Not forever, not completely, but enough. Because flowers don't last. But the feelings behind them do. Even after they wilt. Even after they're gone. The memory of that moment, of reaching out and being understood, stays. And sometimes that was all they had. In a world of arranged marriages and whispered rules, where affection was measured and passion restrained, flowers gave people a way to be free. A language without punishment, a voice without volume, and in that language, love could.
The one that got away.
Everyone has one. The person who stayed in the corner of the mind long after they left the room. The one whose name was never spoken again, but whose memory never stopped whispering. The one that got away wasn't always the greatest love, or the loudest passion, or even the most appropriate choice, but they were unforgettable. In the medieval world, where marriages were arranged and lives were planned before hearts had time to bloom, the one that got away was often the one never chosen in the first place. Sometimes it was a boy from the wrong house, who carved her name into a piece of bark and kept it in his pocket until it faded. Sometimes it was the girl who laughed at all his terrible stories and looked at him like he was more than a blacksmith's son. He loved her for years. But she married a man 3 towns away, and he heard about it from a traveler who didn't know he had just handed him a wound. She had cried at her wedding. No one saw it but her maid. And still, she smiled for the guests and said all the right things, because her heart was not hers to follow. Some met only once. A glance across a field during a midsummer festival. A shared bench at the market. A night dancing barefoot when the harvest was good and the mead was stronger than expected. No names exchanged, just a memory. But that was enough. Enough to live inside them for the rest of their lives. Enough to wonder, Every now and then, what might have happened if they had turned around? There were those who nearly made it. Two people in love, ready to run, bags packed, letters hidden under stones. But something always got in the way. A father fell ill. A storm blocked the road. One waited too long, and the other stopped waiting. And when they met again, years later, with children clinging to their skirts or standing at their side, they smiled politely. But their eyes said everything. I missed you. I searched for you in the faces of strangers. I built a life. But I never forgot you. Sometimes they lived close, in the same town, just far enough to stay apart, just close enough to always be aware. Passing at church, nodding at the market, pretending they were only acquaintances, while their hearts replayed conversations that never happened. He watched her age with grace, and she watched his hair turn silver. And neither of them ever said the words, but they felt them, every time. There were regrets, of course. Words unsaid, letters unwritten, courage not found in time. But there was also gratitude, because the one that got away often left a lesson, a shape, a tenderness. They made the heart deeper, not harder. They taught how to love without possession, how to carry feeling without bitterness. And sometimes that was their gift, not to stay, but to show what was possible. There were rare times when life gave them a second chance. Decades later, after loss, after growth, two people who had once let go, finding each other again and saying quietly, "Are you still you? Because I am still me." But even when there was no reunion, no full circle moment, the memory remained, tucked into the pages of a book, woven into a melody heard only once, felt in the breeze of a certain season. The one that got away never truly leaves. They live in the quietest parts of us, not as ghosts, but as echoes. And even though life moved forward, with duties, with marriages, with children and grief and joy, there was always that one thread in the tapestry that shimmered just a little differently. The one we couldn't hold, but would never let go. Growing old without regret. Not every story ended in heartbreak. Not every life closed with sorrow. Some people grew old with quiet hearts, soft hands, and no bitterness at all. They didn't count their years by what was lost, but by what was lived. They didn't carry the weight of missed chances. They simply let them go. In the medieval world, where life was short for many, growing old was a kind of miracle. To live long enough to see your hair turn white, to feel the air shift across decades, to look back and remember the whole path. It was a gift. And those who had it held it with reverence. They weren't always the ones with grand romances or perfect marriages. Some had never married at all. Some had loved once and never again. Some had made choices that surprised everyone, including themselves. But what they had by the end was peace. Not perfection. Peace. They had learned how to live with the silence, how to embrace the ordinary, how to find joy in repetition. A woman who never bore children might have been called lonely when she was young, but by 60 she knew every neighbor's name, taught the village girls to stitch, and had a garden so full of herbs that no one in town fell ill without a remedy from her hands. She was alone, yes, but not unloved. A man who had once been wild, who had chased dreams too far and come back with nothing but scars, found himself living quietly near the woods, carving spoons, baking bread, listening to birds. He smiled more than he spoke, and when people asked if he regretted never settling down, he simply said, "I found my peace in the stillness." There were widows who lit candles every night and spoke to the dead like old friends. Widowers who walked the same path each morning, tipping their hats to the sky. There were couples who had spent 50 years in the same house, never rich, never famous, but still laughing at the same jokes, still reaching for each other's hands as they fell asleep. They had loved imperfectly, but they had stayed. And in staying, they had built something that did not need to be explained to anyone else. They had grown old together without needing it to be a fairy tale. Just true, just real. They didn't regret what hadn't happened. The paths not taken, the letters never sent, the wild adventures missed, because they had chosen their lives, or they had accepted them. And somewhere along the way, they had made peace with it. They forgave themselves. They forgave the world. And the world, in its way, softened around them. They no longer wanted to be seen. They wanted to see. The way the sunlight changed in autumn. the way children laughed near the well, the way the wind moved through the fields. They remembered their youth, the dancing, the letters, the kisses, but they did not cling to it. It had been beautiful. It had passed. And now there was this. A quieter beauty, a deeper kind. They knew things the young could not. That love wasn't always thunder. That joy could come from butter on warm bread. That healing took time, but it did come. That most of what we think matters doesn't. And the things we think we'll forget stay. They kept secrets, yes. They held stories in their bones, but when they shared them, they did so with laughter, not pain. Not because the sorrow was gone, but because they had learned how to carry it with grace. They did not pretend. They did not dramatize. They told the truth. And then they went on peeling apples or folding linens or feeding the fire. Growing old without regret didn't mean never hurting. It meant finding space for the hurt without letting it define everything else. It meant knowing how to miss someone without breaking every time their name was spoken. It meant sitting with a younger person and saying, "You will survive this," not because it's easy, but because they had. It meant having love in your life. Not always romantic, not always returned, but love all the same. Love for a sister, for a friend, for a dog who followed you home and never left, for a field that bloomed every spring, no matter what had gone wrong. They had lived, and they were still living. Not loudly, but clearly. And the greatest gift they gave, simply by being there, was proof that the story doesn't have to be perfect to be good. That a life doesn't need to be filled with fire to be full. That growing old without regret is possible. If we let go, if we forgive, if we learn to love what we have, even when it wasn't what we once hoped for. Because peace, in the end, is not something we find. It's something we grow. The enduring power of gentle love. It wasn't always wild. It wasn't always grand. The love that lasted, the love that endured beyond war, beyond distance, beyond silence and time, was quiet, gentle. It crept in like morning light, soft at first, unnoticed almost, until one day you realized it had filled the room, warmed your skin, touched everything. Gentle love didn't announce itself. It didn't shout across fields or demand to be heard in crowded halls. It waited. It watched. It listened. It grew. In the medieval world, where affection was guarded and hearts often bruised by duty, gentle love was sometimes the only kind that could survive. It existed in the smallest acts, in the way one person poured water for another, in the way they placed bread on the table without being asked, in the way they noticed a thread caught on someone's sleeve and reached to smooth it away. It was not loud, but it was constant. It lived in marriages not born of passion, but of patience, in friendships that deepened over years of shared work, shared laughter, shared pain. It lived in glances that didn't need explanation, and in hands that reached for each other without thought. Gentle love was not perfect. It argued. It got tired. It made mistakes. But it always returned. It always chose to stay. It apologized. It forgave. It tried again. And that was what made it strong. Not the fire, but the roots. Not the storm, but the shelter. There were couples who began as strangers, bound together by arrangement or circumstance, who slowly built something unshakable, not because they fell head over heels, but because they leaned into each other day by day. They learned, they adapted, they made room, and eventually, they looked at each other across the years and thought, "This is what I waited for, even if I didn't know I was waiting." Gentle love endured in letters written and never sent, in meals prepared and left on doorsteps, in candles lit for someone long gone, in lullabies sung for children who reminded you of someone else. It lived in the heart of a widow who still whispered goodnight into the empty space beside her, in the eyes of a man who tended a grave with hands as careful as prayer. It was not dramatic, but it was fierce in its own way, because gentle love survives what passion cannot. It survives long winters, harsh words, quiet disappointment, the slow wearing down of life. It doesn't need to be fed by grand gestures. It feeds itself on presence, on kindness, on the smallest choices. And that is why it lasts. History forgets the gentle lovers. The chroniclers wrote about queens stolen in the night, knights dying for kisses, letters soaked in tears, but they didn't write about the old couple who sat in silence and still reached for each other's hands. About the girl who cared for her sick mother every day and still found time to place flowers in the window. About the boy who visited the same chapel every week to pray for someone who never came back. But those were love stories too, maybe the most important ones, because they weren't about feeling everything, they were about feeling enough. Enough to stay, enough to give, enough to try again tomorrow. Gentle love doesn't need the world to know. It doesn't need a song. It just needs a moment, and another, and another, until a life is built not on fire, but on warmth, the kind that never burns out, the kind that carries you through. And if centuries from now the names are forgotten, the dates, the places, the details, that warmth will still be there, in the way we hold one another, in the words we say softly, in the care we give without being asked. That is the legacy of gentle love. It doesn't shout to be remembered, it simply never leaves.